My name is Michael. I'm 42 years old, and this happened one fateful autumn in 2023. I had planned an RV getaway with my family, a desperate attempt to mend the frayed edges of our lives by venturing deep into the rugged wilderness of Mark Twain National Forest in North Appalachian, Missouri. At the time, I believed that a few days away from the relentless pace of modern life might be the salve we all needed. I was determined to protect my wife, Linda, and our two children, Emily, 14, and Jake, 10, from the chaos of our everyday lives. I never imagined that our journey would force us to confront something ancient and malevolent lurking in the whispering pines. Our RV was an old, creaky model that had seen better days. As soon as we hit the winding forest roads, it became clear that our trusted vehicle wasn't going to be our silent savior. The heater sputtered and died on chilly evenings, and our outdated GPS led us in circles more than once. I recall that first evening vividly, a biting wind howling outside as we huddled inside our cramped living space, arguing over whether we should have taken a more modern vehicle. Linda's voice was soft but insistent, urging caution, while the kids oscillated between excitement and unease. Tensions flared, and I could feel that every malfunction and miscommunication chipped away at our family's unity. Our destination was a secluded clearing on the outskirts of the forest where we planned to park and settle in for a few days. As the RV rolled to a stop near a makeshift campground, the first hint of something amiss revealed itself in subtle ways. I was checking the engine under the dim light of dusk when I noticed that the tall pines around us whispered with an uncanny persistence. Their branches creaked as if in conversation, and a chill, beyond the autumn's natural bite, seeped into my bones. The following evening, while Linda prepared a simple dinner, Emily sat by the window, transfixed by something outside. I remember her soft, trembling whisper, "Dad, do you hear that singing?" It was a sorrowful melody, barely audible, floating on the wind like a lament from another world. I dismissed it at first as the rustling of the leaves, but as I walked outside with a flashlight, the sound grew unmistakable, like the mournful cry of a spirit lamenting its lost past. Jake, ever the curious adventurer, had been exploring near the RV earlier in the day. He returned, breathless and wide-eyed, tugging at my sleeve. "Dad, look at this," he said, showing me a large oak tree marked with strange, deliberate carvings. The symbols were jagged and archaic, like a language long forgotten, and they sent shivers down my spine. They weren't just random scratches, they looked purposeful, as if left by someone desperate to warn others of an unseen danger. Our next stop was a small, weathered diner in a nearby town, a brief respite before we planned to head deeper into the forest. Over lukewarm coffee, a local man with deep-set eyes and a weary smile leaned in and whispered, "You folks best be careful out there. There's talk of a ghost, the White Lady, roaming these woods. They say she was a pioneer woman betrayed and killed, doomed to wander these trails seeking vengeance, and sometimes other curses follow in her wake." His words, murmured with the gravity of someone who'd seen too much, left an indelible mark on my thoughts. Despite our mounting unease, we pressed on, determined to make the best of our retreat. But as night fell on our second day, the supernatural began to unfurl its presence in full force. I was awoken by the echo of soft, mournful singing, the same eerie melody Emily had mentioned the night before, now mingling with an undercurrent of something more sinister. I crept from our RV and discovered, to my horror, fleeting glimpses of a pale figure in a tattered white dress drifting between the trees. Her eyes, dark and hollow, seemed to plead for something I couldn't fathom. The apparition vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving behind only the haunting silence of the forest. Linda, always the voice of reason, suggested we check an old ranger station we had passed earlier in the day. We made our way there, flashlights cutting through the oppressive darkness, and discovered a dusty diary left behind by a long-forgotten keeper. Its pages told a tale of a witch condemned for her unholy practices, who had cursed these lands centuries ago. According to the diary, her malediction had unleashed not only her vengeful spirit, the White Lady, but also stirred up a host of other dark forces that preyed on the vulnerable, particularly those lost in isolation and strife. As I read the faded words, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. It was as if the very air around us pulsed with malevolent energy. The strain on our family began to show. Michael, my inner self, felt the weight of responsibility like never before. I argued with Linda about whether we should stay and try to solve the mystery or leave while we still could. Linda, cautious and empathetic, favored retreat, while our children, caught between terror and a strange, irresistible fascination, became unwitting markers of the unfolding nightmare. Emily's insightful observations and Jake's inadvertent discoveries of further markings and cryptic symbols deep within the campground only deepened the mystery. Their innocent eyes now saw things I struggled to comprehend. A sorrowful, ghostly figure here, an unsettling shadow there. On the third day, after a sleepless night filled with whispered voices and the constant sense of being watched, I decided that we needed to seek help. I recalled the local historian's name the diner had barely mentioned, a reclusive man known as Mr. Harrison, who had long studied the region's folklore and indigenous lore. With no better option, I took a detour to a tiny, crumbling homestead on the edge of the forest where Mr. Harrison was said to reside. Meeting him was like stepping into another era. His weathered face and deep, thoughtful eyes conveyed decades of wisdom and sorrow. Over a cup of bitter herbal tea, he explained that the spirit we were dealing with was no mere ghost, but the culmination of an ancient curse, a blend of indigenous legends and early settler superstitions. He told me how the White Lady's tragic tale intertwined with that of a local witch whose fury had been awakened when settlers desecrated sacred ground. According to Mr. Harrison, the supernatural manifestations we were experiencing were not just random hauntings. They were deliberate acts of retribution designed to punish those who disturbed the cursed land. He offered us a few protective measures, a blend of indigenous rituals and old-world charms, to help shield us from the malevolent forces. I listened intently, grateful for any glimmer of hope. The historian's advice was clear. Unity was our only chance. He insisted that we must stand together as a family and perform a ritual of protection at the stroke of midnight, using simple ingredients that he provided. Reluctantly, I agreed, feeling the heavy burden of ensuring my family's safety. That very night, under a sky smeared with the ominous hues of a blood-red sunset, we gathered near the heart of our campsite. The air was electric with foreboding as we arranged the items Mr. Harrison had given us. A circle of salt, dried sage, and a small amulet etched with protective symbols. My hands trembled as I helped Linda set up the circle while the children huddled close, their eyes darting between the flickering light of our campfire and the dark, encroaching forest. As the clock neared midnight, a palpable tension gripped the clearing. The usual sounds of the forest were absent, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Suddenly, the silence shattered with a violent gust of wind that snatched the flames from our fire and sent them spiraling into the darkness. The White Lady appeared then, her form more defined and desperate than ever. Her spectral presence was accompanied by an unearthly force that seemed to shake the very ground beneath our feet. I could see her face, marked by sorrow and rage, and felt the overwhelming urge to flee, yet something compelled me to stand my ground. For a few agonizing moments, we all stared in terror as the ghost advanced, her movements both fluid and menacing. the air filled with the acrid scent of smoke and decay, and I knew that this confrontation was not going to be a mere haunting. It was a fight for our very souls. I stepped forward and, with all the resolve I could muster, began reciting the protective incantations that Mr. Harrison had taught us. Linda's voice joined mine, steady and unwavering despite the fear that rippled through her eyes. Emily and Jake clutched each other tightly, their youthful faces etched with both fear and determination. The White Lady's scream tore through the night, a sound that was both mournful and violently enraged. As if in response, the protective circle glowed faintly, a shimmering barrier that pushed the ghost back. For a moment, it seemed as though our combined will was enough to repel her wrath. But then the air shifted. From the darkness beyond our circle, another presence emerged, a formless, malevolent spirit that seemed to feed on the chaos. It was as though the witch's curse had summoned not one, but an army of spectral forces, all intent on tearing our fragile family apart. In the ensuing chaos, a gust of supernatural force slammed into me. I lost my footing and fell, my head momentarily spinning. I watched in horror as Linda was nearly dragged toward the dark woods by an unseen force. With a surge of adrenaline, I reached out, grabbing her hand and pulling her back into the circle. The protective barrier held, but only barely. The air crackled with energy, and for a few heart-stopping seconds the world seemed to teeter on the brink of collapse. Time lost all meaning as the battle raged. I could feel the weight of the curse, the centuries of suffering and betrayal, all converging on this single, desperate moment. The protective charms glowed brighter, their light a small beacon of hope in the overwhelming darkness. I shouted encouragement to my family, urging them to hold on, to trust in our unity. In that moment, every petty argument and fleeting tension we had experienced over the past few days melted away, replaced by a fierce, singular purpose: survival. Slowly, the supernatural assault began to abate. The White Lady's form flickered and receded, her mournful wail subsiding into the rustle of leaves. The formless spirit, too, seemed to lose its cohesion, dissipating like smoke caught in the early morning light. We remained in our circle, hearts pounding, as the forest returned to its uneasy normalcy. The air, heavy with the remnants of malevolence, finally began to clear. In the aftermath of that harrowing encounter, we sat together in silence, each of us processing the terror we had just faced. Linda's hand remained clasped in mine, a silent promise that we had endured, that we would rebuild what had been threatened by the curse. Emily's eyes, wide and haunted, slowly filled with a mix of relief and lingering fear, while Jake, ever the brave little soul, managed a shaky smile that belied the terror of the night. The next morning, the first light of dawn found us quietly packing up the RV. The forest seemed to exhale a long-held breath as if the malevolent presence had been exorcised by our unity. We had not rid ourselves of the curse entirely. The historian's words echoed in my mind, but we had survived its full wrath. I knew that the scars, both physical and spiritual, would linger long after we left these haunted pines. Driving away from the clearing, I caught one last glimpse of the woods through the RV's rear window. In the distance, among the towering pines, I thought I saw a faint, ethereal glow, a reminder that some forces never truly fade away. Our family had been tested in ways I never thought possible. We had faced down a vengeful spirit born of centuries of sorrow and betrayal, and though we had emerged battered, our bond had been forged anew in the crucible of terror. Back in the safety of our everyday lives, I often find myself haunted by memories of that night. The echo of the White Lady's cry, the charged silence before the supernatural storm, and the desperate unity that saved us from certain doom. I've kept the historian's diary tucked away, a somber reminder of the ancient curses that lie beneath the surface of our modern world. Every time I drive past Mark Twain National Forest, I can't help but feel that the whispering pines still hold secrets, that somewhere beyond the beaten paths, the ghost of the past lingers, waiting for the next moment of weakness to resurface. And while I have learned that true strength lies in unity, I also know that some forces are beyond our control. Forces that will always remind us that the world is far more mysterious and dangerous than we could ever imagine. This is not a tale for the faint of heart. It is a reminder that isolation can amplify our deepest fears, that the wilderness holds not only beauty and solace, but also the restless echoes of a dark history. For my family and me, that RV trip into the heart of Missouri was more than a brief escape. It was a confrontation with the supernatural, a test of our resilience, and a lesson in the unyielding power of unity. I share our story now, not as a boast of survival, but as a cautionary tale, a testament to the fact that even in our modern, technology-driven lives, the ancient curses and haunted legends of the past are never truly dead. They wait, hidden in the silent, whispering pines, ready to remind us that some parts of our world remain forever untamed, forever mysterious, and sometimes unforgiving. And so, whenever I look back on that terrifying night, I remember that in the face of overwhelming darkness, the light of family and togetherness is the only beacon that can guide us through. My name is Daniel. I'm 38 years old, and this all happened one cold, restless autumn in 2022. I had recently lost more than I could bear, a divorce that shattered my sense of self, and the death of my closest friend had left me questioning everything. I decided to leave behind the relentless noise of the city and the suffocating weight of my regrets for a solitary RV camping trip at Sam A. Baker State Park, Missouri. I hoped that isolation might bring me the clarity and inner peace I so desperately sought. I set out in my aging RV, a battered, rusty relic that had served me well enough over the years but had begun to show its age. As I drove along the winding roads leading to the park, the vehicle's radio crackled with static, and my GPS, equally outdated, repeatedly lost signal. At first, I chalked these glitches up to old electronics, but as the miles passed under a brooding sky, a nagging feeling told me that something was very, very off. The landscape transformed as I neared Sam A. Baker State Park. Dense forests of towering oak and hickory gave way to steep, rocky outcrops, and the air grew cooler, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. I arrived at a secluded clearing where I could park the RV, away from the bustle of modern civilization, yet not completely isolated. Still, there was an eerie silence that accompanied the beauty of the wilderness, as if the land itself was holding its breath. That first night, I set up a small camp near the RV. I lit a fire and sat quietly, attempting to soothe my racing thoughts. But the solitude only magnified the sound of my own heartbeat, and soon I began to notice strange carvings etched into the bark of an old oak tree just outside my camp. They were unlike any random scratches. These symbols were deliberate, intricate, and bore a resemblance to indigenous art that I had only seen in textbooks. Their presence was unsettling, a silent warning that I couldn't quite decipher. As darkness fully enveloped the clearing, I heard a soft, almost imperceptible echo, a whisper that sounded like my own voice, yet not quite mine. It was as if the forest was mimicking me, twisting my words into a hushed, sinister murmur. At first, I dismissed it as a trick of the wind, or my imagination playing cruel games with my frayed nerves. But as the night wore on, The echo grew louder, more insistent, until I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone. The following morning, while exploring the small park shelter near my campsite, I discovered an old journal left behind by a long-forgotten park ranger. The pages, yellowed and brittle, recounted local legends of a cursed spirit, a dark doppelganger that manifested in those very woods. The journal spoke of how the entity was born from the inner darkness of men, fueled by guilt, regret, and isolation. It claimed that those who were burdened by deep sorrow and remorse were most susceptible to its influence. I couldn't help but feel a chill as I read the faded words. It was as though the journal was meant for me. Over the next few days, the oddities multiplied. The RV's electronics grew even more unreliable. The radio would suddenly blare with strange, discordant voices, and my phone's battery inexplicably drained in a matter of hours. I began noticing inexplicable phenomena, shadows darting just beyond the reach of my flashlight, disembodied whispers trailing behind me as I walked along the narrow dirt paths, and an oppressive sensation of being constantly observed by unseen eyes hidden deep within the forest. Then, one evening, as dusk crept over the horizon, I saw it. A figure that mirrored my every move. I was alone in the RV, preparing a meager dinner of canned soup and stale bread, when I caught a glimpse of a dark shape reflected in the window. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a fleeting distortion of my own tired eyes. But as I turned to face it, I saw nothing there, only the empty interior of my RV. The sensation of being watched persisted, and I started to feel as if a malevolent presence was slowly closing in on me. The tension inside me built steadily. I found myself haunted by memories I had long suppressed, memories of failures, lost opportunities, and the crushing guilt of mistakes made. It was as if every regret, every painful moment of my past had found a way to manifest in the physical world. The doppelganger I saw was not merely an apparition. It was my inner darkness, given form and substance, a sinister reminder of everything I had tried to forget. One night, unable to bear the constant dread any longer, I decided to delve deeper into the mystery. I returned to the park shelter, where I pored over the old journal once more. The entries described a ritual, a solitary ceremony of self-forgiveness that could break the curse of one's inner torment. The instructions were detailed yet simple. Gather elements from the natural surroundings: sage, water from a pristine spring, and a pinch of salt, and recite an incantation that acknowledged one's guilt and embraced the possibility of redemption. The ritual was both a physical act and a deeply emotional catharsis. I resolved to perform the ritual at midnight, hoping that it might help banish the dark specter that had plagued me since my arrival. I spent the rest of the day gathering the necessary items. I trekked through the forest to a nearby spring, its water clear and cool, untouched by human hands. I collected bundles of wild sage, its fragrance sharp and invigorating, and a small bag of coarse salt from a convenience store in the nearby town, a mundane item that, in this context, felt charged with purpose. As night fell again, I prepared my makeshift altar in a small clearing off the beaten path. The air was thick with anticipation, and every rustle of leaves made my heart race. I arranged the sage, water, and salt in a neat circle, its boundaries illuminated only by the pale light of the moon. I sat down at the edge of the circle, my thoughts a tumult of fear and sorrow. I knew that this was my moment of reckoning, the chance to confront the darkness that had haunted me both internally and in the form of that spectral doppelganger. I began the incantation softly, my voice trembling at first as I recited words I barely understood. words that felt as ancient as the forest itself. I admitted my sins, my regrets, and the overwhelming guilt that had burdened me for so long. As I spoke, a wind began to stir, and the trees around me seemed to lean in closer, their branches like skeletal hands reaching out. I could feel a cold presence at the edge of the circle, and then, from the shadows, the figure emerged. It was me, or rather, a twisted, distorted version of me. My doppelganger stood silently, its eyes dark voids of sorrow and malice. It moved with an unnatural grace, mirroring my every gesture as if mocking my attempts at redemption. The presence was suffocating, and for a moment, terror threatened to overwhelm me. But I continued the incantation, my voice growing steadier with each word. I was no longer speaking merely to the void. I was speaking to the darkest parts of myself, the parts that had long been hidden away. The figure paused, its form flickering in the dim light, as if caught between two realms. I felt a surge of energy as the protective power of the ritual began to manifest. A subtle glow emanated from the circle, pushing back against the oppressive darkness. The doppelganger's features began to distort, its menacing form wavering with each syllable of my confession. I could feel the weight of years of self-reproach lifting ever so slightly, replaced by a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, I could forgive myself. The confrontation reached a fevered pitch as the wind howled and the forest around me seemed to roar with an ancient, primal fury. The doppelganger lunged forward, its movements desperate and violent, as if it were trying to force its way into my very soul. I stumbled back, nearly breaking the circle with my fall, but I managed to steady myself and continue the incantation. Every word was a battle cry against the darkness within and without, a desperate plea for absolution. For what felt like an eternity, the clearing became a battleground between my raw, unfiltered grief and the ancient forces of the land. The protective glow of the ritual grew brighter, and slowly, the relentless pressure of the doppelganger began to wane. With a final, heart-wrenching admission of my deepest regrets, a confession of my failures, and a yearning for forgiveness, the figure shuddered and dissolved into the night, leaving behind nothing but a lingering whisper on the wind. In the heavy silence that followed, I remained seated at the edge of the circle, my body trembling, my heart pounding in my chest. I felt an overwhelming sense of relief, as though I had been freed from a burden that had weighed on me for far too long. The supernatural manifestations, the cold whispers, the distorted shadows, began to fade, replaced by a quiet stillness that seemed almost sacred. I realized that while the ritual might not erase my past, it had given me the strength to face it without being consumed by it. In the days that followed, as I repaired the malfunctioning electronics of my RV and resumed a tentative normalcy within the confines of the park, I noticed a profound change within me. The oppressive aura that had cloaked my every step seemed to have lifted, replaced by a cautious optimism. I spent my mornings wandering the forest, not as a lost soul haunted by regret, but as a man who had confronted his inner demons and emerged stronger for it. The trees, once ominous and foreboding, now whispered gently, a quiet reminder that nature, in all its mystery, can also heal. I eventually left Sam A. Baker State Park with a new sense of clarity. Driving away in my once again reliable RV, I felt lighter, as if I'd finally let go of the chains that had held me captive for years. I still hear the faint echo of that long night sometimes, a soft, almost forgiving murmur that reminds me of the power of acceptance and the possibility of redemption. And while I know that life will always be marked by regrets and mistakes, I now understand that the true journey is not about erasing the past, but learning to live with it, and ultimately forgive it. That solitary camping trip in Missouri became more than just an escape. It was a transformative confrontation with the darkness inside me. I learned that the supernatural manifestations I had witnessed were not external forces imposed upon me, but rather reflections of my own inner turmoil. In facing my doppelganger, I confronted every regret, every failure, and every shadow that had haunted my soul. And in doing so, I discovered that even in the deepest darkness, there is a glimmer of light, a hope that guides us toward healing and renewal. Now, whenever I find myself drifting into despair, I remember that night in the forest, the wind, the whispering trees, the spectral figure that once mirrored my pain. I recall the cold clarity that came with accepting my past, and I carry that lesson with me always. My journey continues, but now I walk it with the quiet assurance that while the shadows may never fully disappear, they no longer have the power to consume me. This is my story, a tale of isolation, inner demons, and the courage to confront them head-on. It is a reminder that sometimes the darkest nights lead to the brightest dawns, and that within every tortured soul lies the potential for redemption. My name is Becky Harris, and I'm 34 years old. This all began one cool October weekend when I, along with my two closest friends, Dave Johnson and Mark Simmons, decided to escape the relentless urban grind and seek solace in the wild embrace of Sauk Mountain State Park in northern Missouri. I had been planning this getaway for months, hoping that the solitude of the Ozarks would offer not just a break, but a chance to reconnect with nature and, perhaps, with ourselves. I had always been resourceful and level-headed, qualities that had earned me the role of de facto leader in our small trio. Dave, ever the impulsive adventurer, often dismissed warnings with a roguish grin, and Mark, the quiet soul with an artist's sensitivity, was the one who seemed to perceive every nuance of our surroundings. We piled into my battered old RV, a relic that had seen better days, and set off on what we believed would be a weekend of relaxation, camaraderie, and the kind of honest conversation that only isolation can inspire. The journey was not without its challenges. Early on, the RV's unreliable engine sputtered to life in a series of protests, and our communications gear, meant to be our lifeline, flickered in and out of service as we made our way deeper into the backwoods. I swear, this old thing has a mind of its own, I joked nervously, trying to ease the tension as we navigated narrow, winding roads lined with the dense, ancient trees. Dave laughed, but I could sense a shadow of concern in his eyes. Mark remained silent, his gaze often fixed out the window as if he were expecting something to leap from the foliage at any moment. By the time we reached our destination, the fading daylight was already painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. We found a remote clearing on the outskirts of the park, a spot that promised privacy and a connection to nature's raw power. As we set up camp, a strange unease began to settle over me. It started with the little things, odd, almost imperceptible noises coming from the woods, and a sense of being watched that I couldn't quite shake off. At first, I attributed it to the isolation, the unfamiliar sounds of wildlife, and my own tired mind playing tricks on me. The first real sign that something wasn't right came the following morning. I stepped outside the RV and noticed a series of mysterious footprints circling the vehicle. They were irregular, as if left by a creature that was neither entirely human nor completely animal. "Guys, come check this out," I called to Dave and Mark, my voice betraying my unease. Dave's eyes lit up with a mix of excitement and apprehension as he crouched down to inspect them, while Mark simply stared, his expression darkening. As the day wore on, we tried to dismiss our fears by focusing on the beauty around us, the rugged cliffs, the meandering streams, and the crisp, clear air. But as dusk fell, the forest around our camp seemed to come alive with an eerie, otherworldly energy. We gathered around a small fire, and I attempted to steer the conversation towards light-hearted topics. Yet, every so often, I caught glimpses of movement in the darkness, shadows that didn't belong, shifting shapes among the trees. It was during one of these moments that Mark spoke up in a low, almost hesitant tone. "There's something out there," he murmured, his eyes darting into the blackness beyond the firelight. "I've seen it, moving between the trees." His words sent a chill down my spine. Dave, trying to maintain his usual bravado, scoffed and joked. "Probably just a deer or some local critter. Don't get spooked, man." But even his voice wavered, betraying the uncertainty that had already begun to erode our confidence. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the RV and every rustle outside the door amplified my anxiety. I lay in my bunk, eyes wide open, listening to the low rhythmic sounds that resembled whispered chants mingled with distant, sorrowful moans. At one point, I thought I heard a soft feminine humming, a tune that seemed both familiar and disturbingly out of place. I tried to rationalize it, convincing myself it was just the wind playing tricks, but deep down, I knew something was terribly wrong. The next morning, determined to find answers, I suggested we explore the nearby trails. "There's got to be a logical explanation for all this," I told Dave, trying to mask the tremor in my voice. "Maybe we can find a ranger or someone who knows the area." Reluctantly, Dave agreed, and Mark, still silent and brooding, nodded. We set off along a narrow path that led deeper into the dense forest, our footsteps muffled by a thick carpet of fallen leaves. As we trekked, the forest seemed to grow darker and more oppressive, the trees towering like silent sentinels guarding ancient secrets. Mark led the way, his eyes scanning every detail, while Dave tried to lighten the mood with casual banter that fell flat against the backdrop of our mounting unease. Halfway along the trail, we stumbled upon a clearing where the evidence of human presence, ancient, weathered symbols carved into the bark of gnarled trees, spoke of rituals long forgotten. My heart pounded as I recognized patterns from local Native American legends, tales of a vengeful shaman whose spirit was said to wander these woods. Legend had it that he had once been part of a cult that practiced unspeakable rites, turning to cannibalism as a way to harness dark, forbidden power. I recalled fragments of these legends from my research before the trip, but I had never imagined they could be real. The symbols, etched with a deliberate, almost ritualistic precision, sent a shiver through my body. "This isn't just local folklore," I whispered, glancing at Dave and Mark. "There's something here that's been waiting, watching." Our return to the RV was marked by an oppressive silence. The day's discoveries had sown seeds of doubt and fear in our minds. That evening, as we sat down to an ill-fated dinner in the cramped confines of the RV, tensions boiled over. Dave's earlier bravado had given way to bitter arguments about the risks we were taking. "I told you we shouldn't have come out here," he snapped, slamming his fist on the table. "We're in way over our heads." Mark, whose silence had grown to a near-constant companion, finally spoke, his voice thick with dread. "I'm not saying it's all in your head, Dave. I feel it too. Something is out there, and it's not just a trick of the light." I tried to mediate, urging calm, but every word felt hollow in the face of the unknown terror that lurked just beyond our feeble light. That night, after a restless sleep filled with nightmares of shifting shadows and distorted faces, I awoke to a startling sight. The RV's door was ajar, and on the ground outside lay a fresh set of footprints, much larger and more chaotic than those from the previous day. My pulse raced as I stepped outside, flashlight in hand, to inspect them. The prints led into the thick darkness of the woods, as if inviting, or daring us to follow. Compelled by a mix of fear and determination, I convinced Dave and Mark that we needed to trace the source of these prints. We can't just sit here and wait for something to come to us, I insisted. Reluctantly, they agreed, and we embarked on a perilous journey into the heart of the forest. The deeper we went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The trees seemed to close in around us, and an inexplicable fog began to roll in, obscuring our vision and muffling our sounds. As we navigated through the underbrush, the whispering noises returned, louder and more insistent. It was as if the very forest was trying to communicate with us, warning us away from a fate that had already been sealed. In a clearing surrounded by ancient oak trees, we finally came face to face with the source of our mounting terror, a figure that defied all rational explanation. At first glance, it appeared to be a man, but his form was distorted, his features blurred as if seen through a veil of smoke. The figure moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, its eyes glinting with a malevolent, predatory light. I felt my blood run cold as the creature turned its gaze upon us, and for a moment time seemed to stand still. Dave's usual bravado evaporated into a look of pure terror, and even Mark, who had always seemed so attuned to the natural world, recoiled as if struck by an unseen force. "Run!" I shouted, the command coming out more as a desperate plea than an order. We bolted back toward the RV, the sounds of pursuit echoing behind us. I couldn't tell if it was the creature or the forest itself that was chasing us, but every snap of a twig and every rustle of leaves was filled with sinister intent. We reached the RV in what felt like an eternity, slamming the door shut and bolting it from the inside. The interior of the vehicle, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. We huddled together in the dim light, hearts pounding in unison, as the night outside roared with the sound of our terror. In the midst of our frantic whispers and frantic plans, a blood-curdling scream shattered the relative silence. It was Dave. He had ventured too close to a window in his desperate attempt to catch a glimpse of the creature. The sound of his anguish, mingled with the relentless patter of rain against the RV, was the final nail in the coffin of our hope for a safe night. In the following hours, our situation deteriorated further. The creature, or whatever it was, did not simply vanish. Instead, it began to circle the RV, its eerie form visible in fleeting glimpses through the windows. The supernatural presence we had unwittingly disturbed seemed determined to make our lives a living nightmare. I recalled the local lore, the vengeful spirit of a shaman from a cannibal cult whose corrupted rituals had damned him to wander these woods in search of souls to torment. Whether it truly was that spirit or a manifestation of our own collective fears was impossible to discern. All that was clear was that it was dangerous and violent. The relentless assault on our senses pushed us to the brink of despair. In the cold light of dawn, with the storm still raging outside, we realized that our only hope lay in understanding the entity's nature. Mark, ever the observer, proposed that we search the nearby ranger station for any records or lore that might shed light on our predicament. With no other options left, we ventured out once more, the RV's engine groaning under the strain as we made our way through the deluge and chaos of nature's fury. At the ranger station, a small weathered building that seemed as forgotten as the legends it housed, we met an elderly ranger named Hank. His lined face and wary eyes spoke of decades spent in these woods, and he listened intently as we recounted our experiences. Hank confirmed what we had feared. Local Native American legends told of a shaman whose spirit was twisted by dark rituals and cannibalistic rites, cursed to roam the forests in search of vengeance against those who disturbed his resting place. He mentioned that some tribes had attempted to create protective charms and rituals to keep the spirit at bay, though none had proven foolproof. Armed with Hank's cryptic advice, we returned to our RV with a renewed, albeit grim, determination. It was time to confront the malevolent force that had invaded our lives. We gathered whatever supplies we could find, candles, salt, and a few talismans Hank had mentioned, and prepared for a ritual of protection. As night fell once again, the forest seemed to pulsate with an even darker energy, as if it were aware of our intentions. I led the ritual, reciting the incantations Hank had taught us, my voice trembling but resolute. Mark arranged the protective symbols around the RV, while Dave, still shaken but resolute, kept watch. The air grew heavy, charged with a palpable tension as the boundaries between our world and something far more sinister began to blur. For what felt like hours, we stood in a fragile circle of light, our voices united in a desperate bid for protection. Suddenly, the air was rent by a piercing shriek, a sound so agonizing and inhuman that it shattered our resolve. The creature attacked with a fury we had not anticipated, its form a chaotic blend of shifting shadows and contorted limbs. In the ensuing struggle, chaos reigned. Dave was caught off guard and suffered a brutal assault, his body thrown against the RV's wall as the entity's wrath surged forth like a tidal wave. I fought with every ounce of strength, my heart pounding in terror and determination, as Mark frantically recited the final lines of our incantation. The creature, fueled by its unyielding rage, lunged at us again and again, its eyes gleaming with malevolence. In the midst of the tumult, I realized that survival hinged not just on our protective ritual, but on our ability to work as one, a unity forged in the crucible of fear and despair. With Mark's steady guidance and Dave's desperate courage, we managed to drive the creature back, its form dissipating into the night as our combined voices reached a crescendo. When silence finally fell, it was as though the forest itself exhaled a long-held breath. Dave, though injured, was still with us, and Mark's expression, though haunted, reflected a grim relief. We knew that the malevolent spirit had not been vanquished forever. It lingered in the dark recesses of the forest, waiting for another moment of weakness. But for now, we had survived its assault. In the aftermath, we sat in the RV as dawn broke over the horizon. The storm had passed, leaving behind a battered landscape and the remnants of our harrowing ordeal. My hands still shook as I held one of the protective talismans, a symbol of the fragile hope that had carried us through the night. Dave's injuries would take time to heal, and Mark's silence had grown into a contemplative melancholy. But we all understood that we had come face to face with an ancient evil, a force born of forgotten rituals and fueled by the darkest corners of human history. As we packed up our RV and prepared to leave Taum Sauk Mountain State Park, the weight of what we had experienced settled heavily on my soul. I knew that I would never forget the terror of that night, the feeling of being hunted by a presence that defied explanation, or the raw, unyielding power of nature in its most sinister form. We left the forest with scars, both seen and unseen, but also with the knowledge that some legends, no matter how ancient, are born of real, unspeakable terror. Driving away from the park, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a shadow lurking among the trees. The memory of the mysterious footprints, the whispered incantations, and the piercing scream of Dave remained etched in my mind. I realized that the isolation we sought had revealed not only the beauty of nature, but also its capacity for cruelty and the supernatural. This experience changed me. I became more attuned to the stories whispered by the wind and the secrets hidden beneath the surface of everyday life. And while the forest of Taum Sauk would always hold its dark mystery, I knew I had survived an ordeal that few could imagine. A reminder that sometimes the line between myth and reality is far thinner than we dare to believe. Even now, as I write these words, the memory of that fateful weekend lingers like a half-remembered nightmare. It is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the bonds forged in adversity, and the ever-present possibility that in the quiet corners of the world, ancient evils still whisper their secrets to those who dare to listen. My name is Aaron Mitchell, and I'm 42 years old. This all began one bitter November weekend when I decided to escape the crushing weight of my past. I'd been tormented for years by the guilt of losing my wife, a grief so profound that even the brightest days seemed overcast. In search of solitude and perhaps redemption, I loaded my few belongings into my old RV and headed for Johnson's Shut-In State Park in northern Missouri. I hoped that the park's rugged isolation and storied past would provide me with a quiet refuge, a place where I might confront the demons that had haunted me for so long. The drive was long and uneventful. Rain battered the windshield, and the incessant hum of the tires on the wet road allowed my mind to wander through memories both tender and tragic. My RV, a rusted relic of better days, groaned and wheezed its way through winding country roads. I had known it was unreliable. The engine stuttered at the most inopportune moments, and the radio static was a constant reminder that I was cut off from the familiar world. Still, the isolation was exactly what I needed. I wasn't looking for company. I was looking for silence and time to face the truth of my own soul. After hours of driving through relentless rain, I finally arrived at Johnson's Shut-Ins. The park was shrouded in mist, its narrow canyons and gnarled trees appearing as if they were carved from nightmares. I parked my RV in a small, secluded clearing that offered a precarious sense of safety amidst the rocky outcrops and twisting trails. Unloading my gear, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, even before nightfall. That first night, the RV's creaks and groans seemed amplified by the wind. I set up a small campfire outside, hoping its flickering light might offer some semblance of comfort against the deep darkness that enveloped the park. Yet, as the flames danced, I noticed shadows that moved with no discernible source. At first, I attributed these movements to my weary eyes playing tricks on me, but then I heard it. A soft whisper that seemed to call my name. Aaron. The sound was barely audible, carried by the wind, yet it struck a chord of terror deep within me. I brushed it off as a figment of my imagination, a trick of the isolation and my own guilt, but a nagging dread settled in my heart. The next morning, I set out to explore the park. I needed to clear my mind, to distract myself from the spectral murmurs of the previous night. The trails were rugged, and the terrain demanded cautious steps. As I made my way along a narrow path, the sound of my boots on the wet gravel was the only noise accompanying my thoughts. I recalled reading about local legends of a cursed place within the park known as the Devil's Den, a spot rumored to be the result of a long-forgotten, diabolical pact. According to lore, a desperate soul had struck a bargain with the devil himself, cursing not only his own fate, but also dooming the surrounding land to perpetual torment. The deeper I ventured into the park, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The trees seemed to huddle together, their gnarled branches like skeletal hands reaching for me. I began to notice odd flickers of light in the distance, brief flashes that vanished as quickly as they appeared. Worse still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the very ground beneath my feet was whispering secrets of ancient sin. At times, the wind carried disembodied voices that echoed softly in the stillness, each one calling my name in a tone that was both mournful and accusing. Returning to the RV in the late afternoon, I found a disturbing sight. On the ground near the door were faint, muddy tracks, as though someone or something had been watching me. The prints were irregular, larger than any animal I knew, and they disappeared into the dense undergrowth of the park. A shiver ran down my spine as I realized that these tracks weren't made by any creature of this world alone. I locked the RV door, my pulse quickening as I retreated into the meager safety of its walls. That evening, as darkness swallowed the park whole, I tried to find solace in the routine of preparing dinner. The RV's ancient heater sputtered and coughed, barely providing any warmth against the creeping cold. Every so often, I caught a glimpse of movement at the window, a flicker of a shadow, a fleeting figure. And then, in a moment of unbearable silence, I saw her, the spectral image of my late wife. There she stood, just beyond the reach of the RV's dim light, her form blurred as if seen through a veil of mist. Her eyes, so full of sorrow and longing, met mine for a fleeting heartbeat before dissolving into the darkness. I staggered back, my heart pounding in a wild rhythm. Was it real, or had my mind, tormented by grief, betrayed me? Sleep eluded me that night. I lay in the cramped cot, staring at the ceiling as the rain battered the roof and the whispers of the wind turned into indistinct, mournful chants. In the depths of the night, I thought I heard the soft rustle of footsteps around the RV, the sound of something circling, waiting. Every creak of the old vehicle was a reminder that I was utterly alone, and that the isolation was breeding terrors beyond my control. In a desperate bid to reclaim some semblance of rationality, I decided to visit the park's small visitor center the next day. I needed answers, even if they were steeped in superstition. The building was a modest, weathered structure, its walls lined with faded photographs and relics of the past. Behind the counter sat a man named Hank, an elderly ranger with eyes that seemed to have witnessed decades of unspoken horrors. I recounted my experiences, the whispering voices, the strange footprints, and, most disturbingly, the apparition of my wife. Hank's face grew grave as he listened. He explained that the local legends spoke of the Devil's Den, a cursed area deep within Johnson's shut-ins, where a man, driven to despair, had made a pact with the devil. His soul, forever damned, was said to roam the park, his dark energy infecting the land. "They say that his spirit never rests," Hank murmured, his voice low and measured. "It preys on those burdened by sorrow, drawing their pain into itself." He mentioned that some old protective rituals had been used by local tribes to ward off such curses, though he warned me that these measures were no guarantee against forces older and more malevolent than any human sin. Armed with Hank's cryptic advice, I returned to the RV with a mingled sense of dread and resolve. The hours that followed were a blur of anxious preparation. I scavenged what little I had, a few candles, a small container of salt, and an old pendant that I'd found in a dusty antique shop years ago. I recalled Hank's words about protective symbols and rituals meant to sever the ties with the cursed spirit. As night fell again, the oppressive silence returned, heavy and suffocating. I arranged the makeshift talismans around the RV's perimeter, their presence a thin, desperate barrier against the unseen horror. Standing in the center, I began to recite an incantation that I had pieced together from fragmented lore and Hank's instructions. My voice trembled as I uttered the words, each syllable a plea for redemption and protection. Outside, the wind howled as if in response, carrying with it a chorus of voices that grew louder with each passing moment. Suddenly, the calm of my ritual was shattered by a piercing scream, a sound so anguished and raw that it seemed to tear through the very fabric of the night. My heart stopped for an instant as I realized that the presence had grown aggressive. I stepped back in terror, my mind racing. The scream was not a random outcry, it was a manifestation of the entity's fury, a soul trapped in eternal torment, lashing out at the living. In that moment, the RV shuddered violently, and the lights flickered. I rushed to the window, and what I saw nearly broke me. The spectral image of my wife reappeared, but this time she was not the gentle memory I had clung to. Her face contorted with pain and anger, her eyes blazing with an otherworldly fire. Behind her, a figure loomed, a dark, malevolent form with shifting features, the embodiment of the cursed shaman from the Devil's Den. The creature's presence was overwhelming. It radiated malice and despair in equal measure. I knew I was at a crossroads. The entity was not merely a passive observer, it was an active force, dangerous and intent on drawing me into its vortex of torment. My inner turmoil, the relentless guilt that had defined my existence, was now being exploited by this supernatural horror. I realized that if I did not act, I would be consumed by both my own grief and the cursed spirit's relentless assault. Determination replaced fear as I grabbed the small pendant and the handful of salt. The ritual must continue, and I had to summon every ounce of courage I possessed. I stepped out into the storm, the wind battering my face and the rain mingling with my tears. With each step toward the source of the dark presence, I felt the weight of my past, the memories of my wife, the remorse of my failures, pressing down on me. But I also felt a spark of resolve, a desperate hope that perhaps confronting this malevolent force would allow me to finally lay my inner demons to rest. As I reached a small clearing near the edge of the Devil's Den, the atmosphere grew thick with tension. The spectral figures, my wife's sorrowful apparition and the shifting, dark entity, seemed to converge in a silent standoff. The air crackled with energy and the earth trembled beneath my feet. In the center of this supernatural confrontation, I raised the pendant high and scattered the salt in a trembling circle around me. I began to recite the incantation once more, my voice steadier this time, resonating with both desperation and hope. The dark entity snarled, its form writhing in the storm's fury, as if agitated by my defiance. The winds howled louder, and lightning split the sky, illuminating the clearing in harsh, staccato bursts. In the chaos, I felt the full force of my inner guilt, memories of my wife's final moments, the promises I had failed to keep, and I allowed those painful recollections to fuel my determination. I was no longer just a man haunted by sorrow. I was a man confronting his past, challenging the cursed fate that sought to trap me in endless torment. For what felt like an eternity, the ritual waged a silent battle against the darkness. The entity's screams merged with the clamor of the storm, and every crack of thunder reverberated through my soul. In that climactic moment, as the incantation reached its zenith, I felt a sudden shift, a brief, luminous moment when the oppressive presence seemed to waver. The dark figure faltered, its malevolence momentarily subdued by the power of the protective ritual. I held my breath, praying that the fragile barrier of light would hold, that I could sever the cursed bond once and for all. Then, as the final words of the incantation left my lips, a deafening silence fell over the clearing. The storm slowed, the winds died down, and the oppressive atmosphere seemed to lift ever so slightly. In the quiet that followed, I dared to open my eyes. The apparition of my wife was gone, replaced by the gentle glow of dawn creeping over the horizon. The dark entity had receded into the shadows, its presence diminished, though I knew in my heart that it was not destroyed, only temporarily driven back. I staggered back to my RV, soaked to the bone and trembling from the adrenaline and raw emotion of the encounter. In the solitude of that battered vehicle, I allowed myself a moment to reflect on what had just transpired. I had faced not only a malevolent supernatural force, but also the deepest recesses of my own guilt and sorrow. The ritual, the confrontation, had been both a physical struggle against an external evil and an internal exorcism of my own demons. Over the following days, the park slowly returned to its eerie but less hostile normalcy. The whispering voices and flickering lights became infrequent, and the oppressive weight that had burdened the land seemed to lift ever so slightly. I spent those days repairing what I could of my old RV and tending to the small wounds, both physical and emotional, that the ordeal had inflicted. I made several visits to the visitor center, seeking further wisdom from Hank and piecing together more of the park's troubled history. Each conversation and every faded photograph deepened my understanding of the Devil's Den and the curse that had haunted these lands for generations. Yet, even as I prepared to leave Johnson's shut-in state park, I knew that the scars of my experience would remain with me. The park had forced me to confront a truth I had long avoided: the idea that redemption, while elusive, was not entirely out of reach. I had stared into the abyss of my own despair and come out the other side, battered but resolute in the knowledge that I could, at last, begin to heal. Driving away from the park on that final clear morning, I couldn't help but feel that the journey had been both an escape and a confrontation. A pilgrimage into the heart of darkness that had, in the end, given me the courage to face my own inner demons. The memory of the storm, the flickering apparitions, and the overwhelming power of the cursed presence would forever be etched in my mind. But so too would the realization that, sometimes, the path to redemption is paved with fear, pain, and the courage to stand alone in the face of the unknown. Now, as I continue on with my life, the experience in the Devil's Den serves as a constant reminder. Even in the darkest moments, there is always a spark of hope, a light that can guide us out of the abyss and toward a future where our past no longer defines us. The road ahead may be long and fraught with uncertainty, but I have learned that true healing comes only when we are brave enough to confront the shadows that haunt us, both without and within. And so, with each mile I drive, I carry the lessons of that harrowing weekend with me, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, and a promise that no matter how deep the darkness, the dawn is always waiting just beyond the horizon. My name is Julia Carter. I'm 34, and this is the story of the RV trip that changed my life forever. It all began in late October when I decided to break away from my busy city life and reconnect with nature. I joined a small group of friends on an adventure to Tonka State Park in Missouri, a place notorious for its eerie ruins and haunting local legends. We piled into an old, creaking RV that Mike Anderson, a cautious but resourceful survivalist, had insisted we use. Mike, 36, was our self-appointed protector, always carrying extra batteries, a first aid kit, and even a portable radio. Along with him was Jake Thompson, a quiet 19-year-old local whose deep knowledge of the park's legends lent an air of authenticity to our trip. Then there was Samantha Lee, 32, warm and nurturing, though her anxious nature was already apparent as she fussed over every little detail, especially concerning her young daughter, Lily, who clung to her hand as we loaded up. The journey itself was fraught with minor setbacks. Our GPS, unreliable as ever in these remote areas, led us on a convoluted path, and our cell reception was practically non-existent once we hit the back roads. Even the RV seemed to protest its age, coughing and sputtering as we ascended narrow, winding trails. Despite these challenges, our excitement grew with every mile, and we eagerly anticipated the adventure that awaited us at Tonka. Arriving at the park as dusk began to settle, we were immediately struck by the rugged beauty of the landscape. The towering trees, the rocky outcroppings, and the remnants of an old stone castle created an atmosphere that was both majestic and ominous. Yet, beneath the surface beauty, a disquieting silence hung in the air, a silence that seemed to whisper warnings to anyone who dared listen. That first night, as I settled into my bunk, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The normally comforting sounds of nocturnal wildlife were replaced by an eerie quiet. It wasn't long before the silence was broken by a faint, almost imperceptible giggle that seemed to float on the breeze. I listened intently, my heart beginning to pound as the sound vanished as quickly as it had appeared. I dismissed it at first as a trick of my imagination, but deep down, I couldn't ignore the unsettling sensation that we were not alone. The next morning, while exploring the vicinity of the ancient ruins with Jake, I came across strange archaic carvings etched into a large oak tree. The symbols were unfamiliar yet unnervingly reminiscent of those found in local ghost stories. Tales of a tortured spirit, the ghost of a child whose laughter once rang out in these woods before tragedy struck. Jake's face went pale when he saw them, and he explained in a hushed tone that these markings were believed to be a warning from the past, left behind by those who had suffered here long ago. That afternoon, tensions within the group began to rise. Mike, ever the pragmatist, insisted that we stick to logical explanations, attributing the carvings to vandals or curious teenagers from years past. Samantha, on the other hand, was visibly shaken by the thought that these were genuine signs of something supernatural. I found myself caught between the two, skeptical yet increasingly unsettled by the accumulating evidence that our trip might not be as benign as we had hoped. As night fell on the second day, the atmosphere grew heavier. Samantha's daughter, Lily, awoke in the middle of the night, her small voice trembling as she whispered about children laughing in the dark. Samantha tried to soothe her, but I could see the fear in her eyes. The RV's interior, once a cozy retreat, now felt like a fragile barrier against an unseen menace lurking outside. Later that evening, while we gathered around the RV's interior for a meal, the power flickered and died. Mike's frustration was palpable as he fumbled with his tools, trying to get the lights back on. In the dim glow of our flashlights, I could see the worry etched on everyone's faces. It was during one of these tense moments that Jake quietly mentioned that the local legends spoke of restless spirits, ghosts of children whose laughter once filled these woods, now turned into something far more sinister. Our conversation was abruptly interrupted by a series of knocks on the RV door. At first, we thought it might be another camper seeking help, but when Mike opened the door, there was no one there. Only the cold night air and a lingering, inexplicable feeling of dread. The knocks had been followed by a strange scraping sound, as if someone or something was trying to claw its way in. We all huddled together, each of us struggling to make sense of the disjointed reality that was unfolding before our eyes. Over the next few days, the supernatural occurrences escalated. The RV's equipment continued to malfunction inexplicably. Lights flickered on and off. Radios emitted static-filled voices that whispered unintelligible messages, and even our carefully packed belongings seemed to move on their own. Each night brought with it unsettling sounds, childlike giggles that gradually morphed into haunting wails, footsteps echoing in the distance, and sometimes an almost human-like whisper that repeated our names over and over. I remember one particularly harrowing night when I couldn't sleep. The RV's interior was pitch black, and all I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat. Suddenly, I felt a cold, clammy hand brush against my arm. I froze, every muscle tensed in terror. I was sure it was Lily's hand reaching out to comfort me, but when I turned towards the source, there was nothing there, only the oppressive darkness that seemed to swallow every trace of light. I managed to calm myself enough to speak in a trembling voice to the others, but they too were visibly shaken, each of us feeling the weight of an unseen presence closing in around us. Desperation began to fracture the unity of our group. Accusations and fears were exchanged in hushed tones. Mike argued that we should leave immediately, while Jake insisted that we needed to understand and confront the phenomenon using local indigenous rituals. Samantha, her eyes red from crying, clung to the hope that perhaps the spirit was simply lost and needed help finding peace. I, however, felt an increasing compulsion to uncover the truth behind these disturbances, even as my rational mind screamed that we were meddling with forces far beyond our control. The turning point came on the fourth night. We decided to venture out to the ruins, a place steeped in history and, according to local lore, a nexus of spiritual energy. With Jake leading the way, we trudged through the dense underbrush, our flashlights barely piercing the inky darkness. The ruins loomed before us, an eerie silhouette against the night sky, as if they were remnants of a bygone era still clinging to life. As we approached, the temperature dropped dramatically, and a dense fog began to roll in. The ancient stones seemed to hum with a sinister energy, and I could feel my skin prickling with the sense of being watched. It was then that we saw them, ghostly apparitions of children, their faces twisted in expressions of sorrow and terror. Their laughter, once innocent, had taken on a malevolent edge that sent shivers down my spine. In that moment, Jake explained in a hushed voice that these were not mere figments of our imagination. They were the restless spirits of children who had suffered unspeakable tragedies here long ago. Their presence was both a warning and a manifestation of the park's dark history. He told us that according to local indigenous lore, such spirits could become violently protective if disturbed or ignored, and that a proper cleansing ritual was the only way to appease them. Desperation replaced our earlier disbelief. We gathered around an ancient stone altar that Jake had pointed out, a relic that local shamans once used in their ceremonies. With trembling hands, we prepared for the ritual, gathering natural elements from the surrounding forest as instructed by Jake. I remember the bitter taste of fear as I mixed herbs and chanted words that I barely understood, each syllable resonating with the eerie energy of the ruins. The atmosphere grew electric, charged with an energy that bordered on the violent. The ghostly apparitions began to circle us, their once mournful expressions now contorted with rage. It was as if the very air vibrated with their fury, and the ground beneath our feet trembled with the force of their collective anguish. I could see Mike's knuckles turning white as he clutched his makeshift talisman, and Samantha's eyes filled with tears as she held Lily close. Then the unthinkable happened. Amid our desperate ritual, a violent surge of supernatural energy erupted from the ruins. The spirits, now fully awakened, lashed out with a fury that defied reason. Objects flew through the air as if hurled by unseen hands, and a deafening wail filled the night, a sound so piercing that it felt as if it were shattering the very fabric of our souls. I was thrown to the ground, and in that moment, I experienced a terror so profound it defies description. The entity, a malevolent force that seemed to embody the collective grief and rage of those lost souls, surged forward. I saw its form, a swirling mass of darkness intermingled with fleeting images of tormented faces, each one screaming silently in eternal agony. It was violent, unyielding, and determined to exact its retribution on us for disturbing its slumber. In the chaos, we scrambled for cover. Mike and I fought to push the spirit back with the remnants of our ritual, our voices merging in a desperate plea for mercy. Oh, Samantha, cradling Lily, was frozen in terror, unable to move as the force battered the area around her. I could feel the weight of the supernatural assault pressing down on me, each pulse of energy threatening to tear me apart. The ground shook violently, and I feared that death was imminent. When the tumult finally subsided, we were left gasping in the oppressive silence of the aftermath. The once fierce spirit had receded into the shadows, leaving behind only the echo of its wrath. It was clear that our ritual had only provided a temporary reprieve. The supernatural force was not vanquished, merely momentarily subdued. In that fleeting moment of calm, we surveyed the devastation. Broken branches, scattered relics of our ritual, and a lingering sense of dread that clung to every stone and tree around us. In the days that followed, the scars of that night became a permanent part of our lives. We decided to cut our trip short, the journey back tainted by an ever-present paranoia, and the knowledge that what we had encountered was not merely a haunting, but a violent, living force of nature. Mike maintained his stoic demeanor throughout, though I could see the haunted look in his eyes every time he glanced at the darkened woods. Samantha struggled to comfort Lily, whose innocent questions about the bad people in the woods only deepened the mystery of what we had experienced. As for me, the experience left me torn between disbelief and a newfound respect for the legends that had been dismissed as folklore. I spent countless sleepless nights revisiting the events in my mind, trying to piece together every detail, every sound, and every fleeting image of that horrifying night. I questioned whether my rational mind had simply succumbed to a nightmare, or if the dark forces of Hahatonka were a real, tangible part of our world, a reality where ancient grief and violent spirits could rise to reclaim what was lost. In the end, I couldn't ignore the warnings that the land had whispered to us. Hahatonka was not just a park filled with ruins and scenic trails. It was a place where history, tragedy, and supernatural energy converged. The ghostly apparitions of the children, the violent outbursts of the malevolent force, and the sense of isolation that pervaded every corner of that ancient site left an indelible mark on my soul. Now, months later, I find myself haunted by memories of that fateful trip. I no longer see the world through the same lens of certainty I once did. Every shadow seems to hide a secret, every rustle of leaves a potential warning. I have learned that some legends are born of real tragedy, that the past can reach out to us in ways we might never understand, and that sometimes survival is not just about escaping the physical dangers of the wild, but also confronting the darkness that resides in the forgotten corners of history. I sometimes wonder if, in another time or place, we might have been able to appease the restless spirits for good. But the truth is, some forces, rooted in pain, loss, and a desire for retribution, are not so easily quelled. They linger on, waiting for the next unwary traveler to disturb their eternal vigil. In the end, my journey to Hahatonka was both a fight for survival and a lesson in humility. I learned that nature is not merely a backdrop for our adventures, but a living, breathing force with its own ancient memories and hidden powers. And though I have since returned to a semblance of normalcy, I carry with me the knowledge that somewhere, out there in the depths of the Missouri woods, a sorrowful and violent spirit still roams, forever echoing the grief of those lost to time. That trip shattered my skepticism and replaced it with a wary respect for the unknown. It taught me that sometimes, to truly understand the world, one must be willing to confront the darkness within it, even if that darkness reaches out with cold, unforgiving hands in the dead of night. My name is Ethan Walker. I'm 42, and this happened in the fall of last year when I decided to leave behind the suffocating memories of my past and seek solitude in the Ozark National Forest of Missouri. I had long been haunted by personal failures and the relentless guilt of mistakes I couldn't undo. With a battered RV that I barely trusted and a heavy heart full of regret, I set off on a journey that promised redemption, or so I hoped. I remember the day I left as if it were etched into my memory. The sky was a slate gray, and the chill in the air matched the frost that had settled over my soul. I loaded my RV with just the essentials: a few clothes, some food supplies, and a stack of old records that had once brought me comfort. The engine grumbled to life with an air of reluctance, much like my own spirit. As I pulled away from the last remnants of civilization, the unreliable cell reception and a faulty GPS reminded me that I was stepping into a realm where technology and the modern world had little influence. I drove along winding roads, past deserted farmhouses and dense thickets of trees that seemed to guard the secrets of the land. Every mile took me deeper into the Ozarks, into a landscape where isolation was both a physical and emotional state. The further I traveled, the more the weight of my past seemed to recede, if only slightly, into the background, replaced by an unsettling quiet that loomed on the horizon. After a long day of driving, I finally reached a secluded clearing near an old, dilapidated cabin that looked as if it had been abandoned decades ago. I set up camp and parked the RV on a gravel patch that was barely visible under the creeping vines and fallen leaves. It was here that I first noticed the oddities that hinted at deeper mysteries. As dusk settled in, I saw a small, weathered notebook lying on the ground, its pages fluttering in the breeze. Picking it up, I discovered torn journal entries filled with cryptic scribbles and half-finished sentences. The entries spoke of a family that had vanished without a trace and hinted at sinister happenings that had been covered up long ago. That night, sleep was elusive. Every creak of the RV, every rustle of leaves outside seemed amplified in the darkness. The sound of distant, muffled voices and unexplained rustling made it clear that the forest was not as empty as it appeared. I lay awake, haunted by the feeling that I was being watched, a sensation that both terrified and intrigued me. The next morning, determined to make sense of what I'd found, I ventured out to explore the area. The path led me to the abandoned cabin I'd seen from the clearing. Its wooden exterior was weather-beaten and sagging, with windows that stared blankly like the eyes of a long-forgotten sentinel. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the scent of decay. I found more clues: faded photographs, letters, and a map with scribbled annotations that pointed to several locations within the forest. These items hinted at a series of unexplained disappearances and an old scandal that had been deliberately buried by those in power. At a small isolated general store in a nearby town, I pressed a few locals for information. The shopkeeper, an elderly man with tired eyes, spoke in hushed tones about the old case. A series of vanishings tied to a family whose disappearance had sparked rumors of betrayal, corruption, and even the supernatural. His reluctance and wary glances told me that some stories were better left forgotten, but I was already too deep into this mystery to turn back. Every conversation, every faded document, deepened my curiosity. I began piecing together the narrative. A once prominent family embroiled in scandal, their secrets hidden beneath layers of lies and neglect. The more I learned, the more I saw reflections of my own life in their tragedy. A man burdened by guilt and desperate for redemption, much like myself. As the days passed, my journey became more than just an investigation into an old mystery. It turned into a battle with my inner demons. Memories of my past, my mistakes, and the guilt that had haunted me for years surged forth unbidden. I found myself questioning whether I was truly seeking redemption or simply trying to escape the pain. Each night, the isolation of the forest amplified my inner turmoil, and the silence seemed to echo my regrets. My RV, already a symbol of my precarious journey, began to betray me further. Mechanical issues cropped up unexpectedly. A failing alternator here, a flickering light there, each minor breakdown reinforcing the sense that I was utterly alone in a wilderness that cared little for my plight. The RV's constant reminders of its unreliability paralleled my own doubts about whether I could ever truly leave my past behind. One particularly stormy night, as the wind howled outside and rain battered the RV, I received a shock that nearly shattered my already fragile resolve. While reviewing the old journal entries by the weak glow of a battery-powered lamp, I noticed that one of the pages had a fresh smear of dirt, almost as if it had been handled recently. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized that someone, or something, might have been there with me. In the midst of the storm, the RV's engine sputtered and died. With no power and a raging storm outside, I was forced to leave the relative safety of my mobile shelter and seek refuge in the abandoned cabin. The darkness of the forest, lit only by intermittent flashes of lightning, took on a menacing quality. Every shadow seemed to shift with a life of its own, and the howling wind was punctuated by strange, almost animalistic cries. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was even more oppressive. The building creaked and moaned as if in pain, and I could almost hear the whispers of voices long past. I huddled in a corner, clutching the notebook and a half-burned candle, waiting for the storm to pass. It was in that tense silence that I began to hear a soft, rhythmic tapping, a sound like footsteps echoing in the empty corridors of the cabin. I couldn't tell if it was real or a trick of my anxious mind, but the sound set my nerves on edge. The following morning, with the storm finally spent but the unease lingering, I decided that I couldn't ignore the mysterious events any longer. I fixed what I could on the RV, a temporary patch here, a makeshift fix there, and resumed my journey deeper into the forest, following the clues left in the map and the journal. The paths became more treacherous, the trees denser, and the silence more absolute. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, watching my every move. As I navigated a narrow, winding road, a sense of being followed crept over me. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, fueled by the stress of the past few days. But then I saw a figure at the edge of my vision, a shadowy presence darting between the trees. I slowed down, heart pounding, and peered out the window. There was no one there. I chalked it up to nerves, but deep inside I knew that I was not alone. That night, while parked in a clearing illuminated only by the stars and the gentle glow of my RV's dashboard, I heard it again. A rustling in the underbrush, followed by a sound that unmistakably resembled footsteps. I sat frozen, straining to listen as the sounds grew closer, then faded away. In that moment, the forest felt alive with secrets, each rustle and whisper a clue to an unsolved past that was intertwined with my own. Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, I retraced my steps to the abandoned cabin where I had taken refuge during the storm. I felt compelled to return, not just to uncover the secrets of the long-vanished family, but to confront the darkness that had been stalking me. With a heavy heart and trembling hands, I opened the creaking door of the cabin once more. Inside, the air was colder, and the oppressive atmosphere seemed to have deepened. I explored every corner of the dilapidated building, finding new evidence that I hadn't noticed before. A hidden drawer containing old letters that hinted at betrayal, blackmail, and a cover-up orchestrated by powerful local figures. One letter in particular sent a chill down my spine. It described a confrontation with a shadowy figure, a descendant of one of the conspirators who had vowed to keep the truth buried at any cost. As I read the letter, a noise startled me from behind. I turned sharply to see a figure standing in the doorway, a person cloaked in darkness, with eyes that seemed to bore into my very soul. The figure spoke in a low, measured tone. "You shouldn't be here." I recognized the voice from the letters, the very voice of the person who had been entangled in this decades-old scandal. The ensuing moments were a blur of adrenaline and terror. I bolted from the cabin, the mysterious figure in pursuit. The dense forest became a labyrinth of twisting paths and shadowy clearings as I ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Every step felt like a desperate bid for survival as I pushed through the underbrush, the sound of footsteps closing in behind me. I didn't dare look back, for fear of what I might see. A relentless pursuer determined to silence me and keep the past hidden forever. After what seemed like an eternity, I managed to lose my pursuer in a thicket of dense trees. Gasping for breath and trembling with fear, I sought refuge near a small, overgrown clearing where an old stone monument stood, a relic of the past that the letters had mentioned. It was there, beneath the crumbling monument, that I discovered the final piece of the puzzle. A sealed envelope addressed to me in a shaky, familiar hand. Inside the envelope were documents that tied together the entire mystery, a web of betrayal, corruption, and a long-concealed tragedy. The documents detailed how a once-respected family had been torn apart by greed and deceit, their disappearance orchestrated to cover up a scandal that had involved influential local figures. Reading the contents, I couldn't help but see parallels with my own life. The burdens of guilt and regret, the desperate need for redemption, and the unyielding pull of a past that refused to let go. At that moment, the shadowy figure reappeared, not with hostility, but with resignation. "You were meant to find this," they said quietly. It was as if the mystery, and perhaps even my own journey, had been predetermined. A path I was destined to walk to uncover truths both external and internal. The figure explained that their family had been entrusted with the secret for generations, a secret that had now found its way to me as a form of atonement. In that surreal exchange, I realized that facing this darkness was not just about solving a cold case, it was about confronting the ghosts of my own past. In the days that followed, I made the difficult decision to report everything to the authorities. The local law enforcement was initially resistant, their dismissive attitudes and hostile glances confirming that some secrets were too dangerous to unravel openly. But armed with the documents and my own testimony, I managed to spark an investigation that slowly brought the old scandal into the light. The process was grueling and fraught with obstacles, yet it offered me a glimmer of redemption. I was not only unearthing a forgotten tragedy, but also coming to terms with the mistakes of my own past. Returning to my RV, now repaired enough for the long journey back to civilization, I felt a cautious hope stirring within me. The experience had been harrowing, a relentless confrontation with both external dangers and internal demons. I knew that the forest had changed me. Its isolation had forced me to confront truths I had long tried to bury. The mechanical failures of my RV, the cold silence of the abandoned cabin, the relentless pursuit by a vengeful shadow. They were all manifestations of a past that needed to be reconciled before I could move forward. As I drove away from the Ozark National Forest, the weight of my experiences settled into a quiet resolve. The winding roads stretched before me, bathed in the soft light of dawn, and I realized that I was no longer the man I had been when I first left my old life behind. I had faced the darkness head-on, both in the world around me and within my own soul. The mystery of the missing family and the corrupt legacy that had haunted the region had intertwined with my own journey, forcing me to confront my guilt and emerge with a fragile sense of forgiveness. In the months that followed, I continued my path of self-discovery and healing. I spoke with those affected by the old scandal, listened to their stories, and found solace in the shared burden of regret and loss. Each conversation, each memory, was a step toward redemption, a step that reminded me that even in the darkest corners of the past, there can be a path to light. though the echoes of the Ozarks still whisper in my mind, the relentless footsteps in the forest, the desperate chase under stormy skies, and the quiet sorrow of a family lost to time. I now carry those memories as a testament to the strength it takes to face one's own demons. I learned that sometimes isolation is necessary not as a punishment, but as a crucible for transformation. In the solitude of the wilderness, I found the courage to confront my past and accept that redemption, though elusive, is possible. Now, as I settle into a quieter life, I remain ever mindful of the lessons learned during that fateful journey. The shadows of the Ozarks may still linger in the recesses of my memory, but they no longer terrify me. Instead, they serve as a constant reminder of the fragile resilience of the human spirit and the power of truth, even when it is wrapped in the darkest mysteries of the past. My journey through the Ozarks was not just a tale of suspense and danger. It was a journey into the heart of my own sorrow, and, ultimately, toward a tentative forgiveness. And as I continue along the open road of life, I hold on to the hope that every ending is also a new beginning, where even the deepest regrets can eventually give way to healing and the promise of redemption. My name is Rebecca. I'm 34 years old, and this is the story of how a long-awaited reunion turned into a fight for our very souls at Tonka State Park in Missouri. It began as an escape, a break from our mundane routines, but ended as a nightmarish journey where ancient evil resurfaced, threatening every ounce of our being. I had planned the trip meticulously, or so I thought. I was the one who researched every inch of Tonka, drawn by its dramatic ruins, deep legends, and the promise of a reconnection with nature. I invited 3 of my closest friends: Jonathan, the thrill-seeker who loved to push limits; Elise, whose sensitive intuition always seemed to pick up on things most of us missed; and Marcus, our ever-witty companion, whose humor often lightened even the darkest moods. Our plan was simple: a week-long RV expedition to relive our shared history, to celebrate friendship, and to escape the suffocating grind of daily life. We rented an old RV that was charmingly retro but clearly past its prime. It rattled and groaned with every turn, its GPS unreliable, and lights flickering at the worst possible moments. I should have known then that our bad equipment would foreshadow the horrors to come, but at the time, I chalked it up to nostalgia. Our journey began on a crisp autumn morning. The air was cool, and the golden light of early fall bathed the countryside as we made our way towards Tonka. We laughed and joked along the way. Jonathan recounted his latest escapades with a hint of arrogance. Marcus joked about our outdated RV, and Elise listened quietly, her eyes occasionally clouding with an emotion I couldn't quite decipher. That first night, after a long day of travel, we set up camp on a clearing not far from the main ruins. I remember sitting by a small campfire, feeling the warmth of the flames as they danced against the backdrop of towering trees. Suddenly, a faint, childlike laughter floated on the wind, a sound so delicate yet so chilling it froze me in my tracks. I glanced around, trying to pinpoint the source, but the darkness swallowed the forest. I mentioned it to the group, but Jonathan waved it off as a trick of the wind, while Marcus tried to laugh it away. Elise, however, sat silently, her eyes wide with a dawning terror. The following day, our tensions began to rise. Our RV's failing GPS led us down unfamiliar, winding roads until we eventually found ourselves near the outskirts of Tonka. Jonathan insisted on forging ahead despite my concerns, his bravado fueling his decision-making. Elise, visibly anxious, kept suggesting we double-check our route against an old map I had brought along. while Marcus's humor faltered in the face of the growing unease. It was during one of these heated debates that we discovered strange footprints near the RV, a series of deep, irregular impressions that did not match any animal we knew. Their appearance was bizarrely human-like, yet they seemed too large, too deliberate. That evening, as darkness settled over the park, the atmosphere turned oppressively quiet. The usual nighttime symphony of crickets and rustling leaves was absent, replaced by an eerie stillness that made my skin crawl. I was alone on a short walk to stretch my legs when I noticed something even more unsettling: symbols carved into a large, ancient oak. The markings were primitive, yet oddly mesmerizing. A mix of indigenous designs and something far more sinister, reminiscent of dark rituals. I took a picture with my phone, my hands trembling, and hurried back to the RV. The following night, things escalated. A violent gust of wind rattled the RV, and as the storm clouds rolled in, a piercing scream, human and yet inhuman, ripped through the silence. Marcus, who had been dozing off, bolted upright and clutched his side. In the chaos that ensued, Jonathan tried to reassure us all with his usual bravado, but his words were drowned by the cacophony of the storm and the sound of something, or someone, moving just beyond the reach of the flickering headlights. In the early hours of that night, Elise confided in me, whispering that she felt an oppressive presence stalking us, something that defied explanation. Her eyes glistened with fear as she recounted a fleeting glimpse of a dark, shifting figure near the tree line, a creature that morphed in the dim light from something humanoid to something monstrous. I felt a chill deep in my bones, a realization that our predicament was far beyond a series of unfortunate coincidences. Over the next few days, the supernatural occurrences intensified. The RV's failing systems made every night a gamble between intermittent light and suffocating darkness. Jonathan's reckless insistence on pressing forward clashed with Elise's growing dread and Marcus's anxious humor that slowly dissolved into panic. Our once cohesive group was splintering under the weight of our shared terror. I took it upon myself to document everything in a journal, detailing the creeping dread, the strange symbols, and the bizarre phenomena that began to define our every moment. Late one afternoon, while rummaging through a dusty compartment in the RV, I discovered an old local guidebook tucked away, a relic from a previous era. Its pages were filled with accounts of indigenous legends and whispered tales of curses, skinwalkers, and witches that haunted the forests around Tonka. One particular passage sent shivers down my spine, a warning of a hybrid entity, an evil spirit that could assume multiple forms, from a menacing humanoid figure to a spectral, ragged witch, roaming the woods and preying upon the unsuspecting. The description matched perfectly with the fleeting visions we had seen. That evening, as dusk crept in, our unease reached a fever pitch. I sat outside the RV, journal in hand, trying to focus on writing down every detail of our experiences. The night was unnervingly silent, and the stillness was shattered by an almost imperceptible rustling from the trees. I looked up and saw, just at the edge of the firelight, a figure standing motionless. My heart pounded in my ears as I strained to see, but the figure melted away into the shadows before I could call out. I woke in a cold sweat later that night, jolted awake by the sound of muffled footsteps outside. I peered through the small window of the RV and saw nothing but darkness. But then, I noticed a flash of movement, a shape, almost too human, moving stealthily among the trees. It was as if someone, or something, was circling our camp, watching us. I roused Elise, who immediately whispered about her own vision of a dark silhouette that loomed near the tree line. Jonathan, now visibly shaken, argued that it was probably just a deer or a trick of our anxious minds. But deep down, I knew that explanation would no longer suffice. Our breaking point came on a stormy night when the entity fully revealed itself. The RV was parked near a clearing, and the wind howled as torrential rain pounded the metal roof. In the midst of this chaos, a violent crash at the door snapped us into a state of sheer terror. I recall the shrill sound of splintering wood and a guttural snarl that shook the very air around us. In that instant, our friend Marcus was thrown from his seat, and a deep gash appeared on his side, an injury that signified more than mere misfortune. The creature, now unmistakably real, burst into our space with a terrifying presence. Its form was a macabre tapestry of indigenous skinwalker lore and cursed witchcraft, a figure that shifted in and out of clarity. One moment, it was a dark, gaunt humanoid with eyes that burned with malevolence. The next, it was a tattered apparition of a witch, her ragged dress swirling as if caught in an eternal storm. It lunged at Marcus with an unholy ferocity, and in the ensuing chaos, the creature's attack was brutally violent. I recall the sickening sound of a bone snapping, and then the sudden, heart-stopping realization that Marcus was not coming back. In the aftermath, as the creature melted back into the shadows, our group was left fractured and broken. Jonathan's earlier bravado was replaced by a stunned, fearful silence. Elise wept uncontrollably, her earlier intuition proven devastatingly right. I clutched my journal as if it were a lifeline, my hands trembling with the weight of what we had witnessed. The loss of Marcus was a stark, brutal reminder of the deadly reality we now faced. The remaining hours that night were a blur of frantic decisions and whispered plans. We were trapped, isolated in a remote part of the park, with a malevolent force that seemed to thrive on our terror. I took charge, consulting the old guidebook for any clue on how to repel or appease the entity. The text described a ritual, a counter-ritual using indigenous symbols and offerings to drive away the cursed spirit. It wasn't a guarantee of safety, but it was our only hope. Elise and Jonathan, though still reeling from the trauma, agreed to help me gather the necessary materials. We scoured the surrounding woods for specific herbs mentioned in the guidebook and collected natural offerings. A few pieces of charcoal, water from a nearby creek, and even a handful of soil from an ancient oak. With every step, the forest seemed to watch us, its silence oppressive and full of unseen menace. As we returned to the RV, the oppressive weight of our isolation became palpable. The storm had eased into a steady drizzle, but the night remained thick with foreboding. We arranged ourselves in a circle just outside the RV, where the open sky allowed the ritual to be performed. I recited the incantations from the guidebook, my voice wavering as I tried to maintain a semblance of control. Elise's tearful eyes met mine, and Jonathan's once defiant look was now replaced by desperate hope. We poured our collected offerings into a small fire and allowed the smoke to rise, praying it would carry our plea for mercy to forces beyond our understanding. For a few excruciating minutes, nothing happened. Then, as if answering our desperate call, the air around us seemed to shudder. The smoke thickened, twisting into shapes that resembled ancient symbols. The temperature dropped, and the oppressive presence that had haunted our nights for days became almost tangible. A force that pressed against our very souls. It was then that we saw it again, emerging from the darkness. The creature stood at the edge of our circle, its eyes glimmering with malevolent curiosity. It did not charge immediately. Instead, it hovered, as if assessing our ritual, its form flickering between the grotesque and the spectral. Jonathan, ever the risk-taker, stepped forward. "This is insane," he muttered, but his voice betrayed his terror. We shouldn't be doing this. But it was too late for doubt. The ritual had begun to take effect. The creature recoiled as if burned, its form wavering violently in the rising smoke. I could feel the power of our collective will pushing against it, a desperate stand against an ancient force of evil. The entity let out a scream that was neither human nor animal, a sound that seared itself into our memories. For several agonizing minutes, time seemed to stretch, each second a battle between hope and despair. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature dissipated into the night, swallowed by the lingering mist and the fading smoke. We stood there, breathless and drenched in sweat and rain, uncertain if the threat was truly gone or merely in retreat. In the silent aftermath, we faced the horrifying truth. Marcus was gone. The cost of our defiance was steep, a friend lost to a force that might never truly be vanquished. Our group, once unified by shared memories and laughter, was now shattered by grief, fear, and the burden of what we had encountered. Jonathan sank onto the ground, his eyes hollow, while Elise clung to me, sobbing softly into the darkness. I spent the rest of that night in a restless vigil, journaling every detail of the events as they unfolded. I wrote about the terror, the inexplicable omens, and the raw, primal fear that had taken hold of us. I wrote until my hand ached and the words on the page became a lifeline, a testament to our struggle and a desperate attempt to understand a horror beyond reason. When dawn finally broke, its weak light filtering through the mist, we knew we had to leave Tonka. The park, with its storied ruins and shadowed legends, had claimed its toll. As we packed the remains of our battered RV and the scant belongings we had left, we made a silent vow never to speak of the events again. Except, perhaps, in my journal, where every detail would be preserved for as long as I lived. The journey back was a blur of sorrow and haunted silence. Jonathan drove in a trance-like state, his earlier arrogance replaced by a heavy resignation. Elise sat quietly, lost in memories of that stormy night and the childlike laughter that now seemed a distant echo of something far more sinister. And I, burdened by the weight of our shared loss and the knowledge of what lurked in the dark corners of Tonka, clutched my journal tightly as if it were the only proof that our ordeal had ever been real. Even now, years later, I find myself haunted by the memories of that fateful trip. The forest still whispers in the silence of the night, and sometimes, when the wind is right, I hear that same childlike laughter, an echo of a terror that refused to die. The entity we encountered was dangerous, violent, and utterly relentless. It was not a mere specter that lingered in the shadows, but a living embodiment of an ancient curse, one that demanded sacrifice and reveled in the isolation and vulnerability of those who dared trespass into its domain. My name is Rebecca, and I carry the scars of that night in every fiber of my being. I have learned that some places hold secrets that should remain undisturbed, that some legends are born of truths too terrible to fully comprehend. Our brush with the supernatural at Tonka was not just an encounter with a ghost or a witch. It was a confrontation with the primordial forces of fear and despair, forces that remind us of our fragility in the face of the unknown. If you ever find yourself drawn to the wild, rugged beauty of Missouri's backwoods, heed my warning. Respect the land, respect the legends, and never underestimate the darkness that can hide behind a friendly smile or a well-worn trail. For in the heart of Tonka, as in all great mysteries, survival is not guaranteed, and some horrors once awakened never truly rest. My name is Ethan. I'm 42 years old, and this happened in the depths of Missouri's Mark Twain National Forest, a place where the rustle of ancient pines hides secrets too painful to name. I had just left behind the wreckage of a failed marriage and the suffocating memories of lost love, and I craved solitude. I believed that by embracing isolation in the wild, I might find some measure of redemption. Little did I know that the forest had its own way of dredging up ghosts, both literal and those within my soul. I drove my aging RV, a clunker I'd restored with as much hope as desperation, as far from the city as my heart could carry me. The vehicle rattled on uneven roads, its engine sputtering, the heater refusing to work properly on the chill of early autumn evenings. Even the radio, which I'd hoped might provide comfort with familiar voices, instead crackled with static and odd snippets of old folk songs. Each mechanical failure was a reminder that my journey was as fraught with challenges as my inner turmoil. I found a small clearing near a forgotten trail, surrounded by towering pines and the haunting beauty of untouched nature. I set up camp with a quiet determination, hoping that a few days away from everything would give me the space to sort through the guilt and regret that had long plagued me. I built a small fire, its orange glow dancing against the darkening sky, and settled into the solitude of the forest. That first night, as I sat alone with only my thoughts for company, I began to notice subtle signs that something was not quite right. I was rereading a battered book of local legends when I first heard it, a barely audible whisper, like a distant sigh carried by the wind. At first, I dismissed it as the rustling of the leaves or the creaking of the old RV settling into its makeshift home. But then, the radio started to pick up disjointed fragments of words in a language I didn't understand, and I could swear they sounded like a warning. Unable to sleep, I stepped outside and wandered a short distance from my camp. The forest was dense and silent, the only sound the soft crunch of twigs beneath my boots. Then I saw them, symbols, carved deeply into the bark of a nearby pine. They were strange, a mix of indigenous markings and something else, something sinister. I ran my hand over the grooves, feeling the cold, rough lines, and a chill raced up my spine. I took up my phone and snapped a few pictures, though I doubted that I'd ever muster the courage to show them to anyone. The following morning, a pall of unease lingered over me. I tried to convince myself that the previous night's events were nothing more than the product of an overactive imagination fueled by solitude and grief. I busied myself with small tasks around the RV, fixing the broken window latch, checking the fuel gauge, and attempting to coax the sputtering engine into life. Yet, the unsettling feeling only deepened. That afternoon, while rummaging through the clutter in the RV's storage compartment, I discovered an old, water-damaged journal. Its cover was worn, and the pages inside were filled with tales of the forest, a mix of indigenous lore and local legends. One passage, in particular, drew my attention. It described a benevolent spirit who had once been a woman of great beauty and kindness, only to be betrayed by those she loved. In her anguish, she turned vengeful, and her spirit roamed the woods, seeking to right ancient wrongs by lashing out at the living. The description was chillingly precise. She was said to manifest at the edge of perception, her sorrowful eyes reflecting both longing and fury. I couldn't help but feel that, in some twisted way, she might be connected to the ghosts of my own past. That night, as the sun dipped below the horizon and darkness swallowed the forest, I sat by my dying campfire, the journal open on my lap. The temperature dropped sharply, and the usual nocturnal chorus of crickets was conspicuously absent. Instead, an oppressive silence blanketed the woods. I began to read aloud the incantations and stories from the journal, hoping that the words might somehow offer me solace. Then, out of the stillness, came a sound, a faint, sorrowful moan, as if someone were crying in the distance. My heart pounded as I strained my ears. I told myself it was just the wind, carrying the echoes of the past. But the forest had other plans. While reading, I caught a glimpse of movement at the edge of my vision, a shadow that darted behind the trees. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there. I felt a profound loneliness, as if I were being watched by eyes that saw through the veneer of my solitude and into my soul. I hurried back into the RV, bolting the door and trying to shake off the growing dread. For the next couple of days, I tried to immerse myself in my own thoughts and the natural beauty around me. I hiked along narrow trails, admired the shimmering dance of light through the leaves, and even attempted to repair some of the RV's more persistent faults. Yet, every step I took was haunted by the feeling of being followed. The radio continued its erratic broadcasts, and on more than one occasion, I heard whispered words just beyond comprehension, fragments of a language that seemed ancient, weighted with sorrow and warning. One particularly stormy evening, as I sat curled up with a mug of lukewarm coffee, I decided to venture out to a nearby clearing where the symbols had been etched. The wind was picking up, and rain began to fall in heavy sheets, blurring the world into streaks of darkness and light. With my jacket pulled tight and a lantern in hand, I made my way cautiously through the underbrush. Every snap of a branch and rustle in the leaves sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. The symbols on the trees loomed in the flickering light, each one a stark reminder of a warning I could barely comprehend. Suddenly, I heard a soft, melodic sound, a lullaby of sorts, sung in a voice so full of sorrow that it made my heart ache. I followed the sound, drawn forward as if by some invisible force. It led me to a small grove where an ancient oak stood, its gnarled branches reaching out like twisted arms. There, illuminated by a shaft of moonlight piercing through the storm clouds, stood a spectral figure. It was a woman, clad in tattered garments that moved as if caught in an eternal breeze. Her eyes were deep wells of sorrow and regret, and for a moment I felt as if she were a mirror reflecting all my lost hopes and shattered dreams. I froze, unable to tear my eyes away. The apparition did not move, merely watched me with an intensity that was both mesmerizing and terrifying. I could feel my pulse in my ears, the sound of my own breath loud in the quiet storm. The spectral figure raised a trembling hand as if beckoning me closer, and in that moment, I understood. She was the ghost of a long-forgotten love, a personification of grief and vengeance. My mind raced. Was she here to condemn me for my own betrayals, or was her presence a manifestation of the guilt that had tormented me since the end of my marriage? Before I could decide, the wind howled louder, and the figure began to fade, leaving behind only the lingering echo of that sorrowful lullaby. I staggered back to the RV, my heart pounding, my mind reeling with questions that offered no answers. The following morning was overcast, the remnants of the storm leaving a heavy, damp chill in the air. I sat at the small table inside the RV, poring over the journal and trying to make sense of the events. The entries grew increasingly frantic, as if the author had struggled to document a reality that defied explanation. I read about the ancient ritual meant to bring peace to tortured souls, a ritual intended to summon the spirit in order to offer it the closure it desperately sought. Desperation clawed at me. Could this ritual help me confront not only the ghost that haunted these woods, but also the demons that plagued my heart? That evening, with the journal as my guide, I gathered what little supplies I had. I collected water from a creek that meandered near my campsite, picked up some pieces of charcoal from the dying embers of my fire, and even dug up some soil from beneath an old oak tree. The ritual described in the journal was not elaborate. It was raw, a desperate plea to the spirits for forgiveness and reconciliation. I cleared a small space in front of the RV and arranged the items in a circle. The atmosphere was thick with foreboding, the forest silent as if in anticipation. With trembling hands, I began to recite the incantations. My voice, hoarse from days of neglect, wavered as I spoke words that seemed to bridge the gap between my pain and the ancient sorrow that haunted these woods. The air grew heavy, and the temperature dropped noticeably. The symbols I had seen on the trees seemed to glow faintly in the firelight, as if infused with a power I could neither comprehend nor control. Then, amidst the rising tension, the radio sprang to life. The static resolved into a series of clear, measured phrases in that ancient dialect, echoing the words of the ritual. It was as if the forest itself had lent its voice to my plea. My heart pounded, each beat echoing in the profound silence that enveloped me. Suddenly, the gentle murmur of the wind was replaced by a shuddering silence. The lantern's light flickered wildly, and for a heartbeat I thought I saw the spectral woman reappear. This time, however, she was not at the edge of my vision, but right in front of me. The ghost stood, ethereal and imposing, her eyes fixed on mine. I could see the raw anguish etched into her features, and in that instant I understood that her sorrow was intertwined with my own. For a long moment, we simply regarded each other, the living man seeking solace and the spirit burdened by an ancient, unfulfilled longing. Then, as if compelled by some shared need for closure, I stepped forward. My voice, steadier now than I felt, continued the incantations, pleading for a reconciliation between the past and the present. I could see her form wavering as if caught in a gentle current, the sorrow in her eyes softening. But the moment was fleeting. With a sudden, violent gust of wind, the ritual circle was disrupted. The ghost let out a wail, a sound of anguish and despair that shook me to my core. The lantern's flame was snuffed out, plunging me into darkness, and I scrambled to relight it. When the light returned, the spectral figure had vanished, leaving only the haunting memory of her sorrowful gaze. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the silence of the forest pressing in on me. The ritual had not banished the spirit. Instead, it had revealed the depth of her torment. I knew then that she was not an enemy to be vanquished, but a broken soul yearning for peace, a soul that mirrored my own need for redemption. The night passed slowly. I huddled inside the RV, every creak and groan of the old vehicle echoing like a reminder of the fragile boundary between my reality and the supernatural. I lay awake, haunted by memories and visions, my mind a storm of regret and hope. In those long, sleepless hours, I began to see that the forest, with all its eerie omens and spectral visitors, was offering me a choice. I could continue to hide behind my guilt and sorrow, or I could face these ghosts head-on and attempt to heal the wounds they, and I, carried. At dawn, as the first light filtered through the rain-washed trees, I made a decision. I packed what little I had left, determined to leave the forest and the haunting memories behind, yet also resolved to carry the lessons of that night with me. I started the RV, its engine protesting once more as it rumbled to life, and drove away from the clearing, leaving behind the circle of offerings and the lingering whispers of the past. The journey out of Mark Twain National Forest was both physical and emotional, a slow, painful retreat from the darkness that had gripped me, but also a cautious step toward healing. The radio, now silent, seemed to hold its secrets close, and the old RV continued its mechanical lament as I navigated the winding back roads. Yet, amid the turmoil, I felt a glimmer of hope. I had confronted the spectral manifestation of my own grief, and in doing so had begun to untangle the knots of regret that had bound me for so long. Even now, long after leaving the forest behind, I carry the memory of that night with me. the ghost of the sorrowful woman, the symbols carved into ancient bark, and the echoing static of a long-forgotten language, all serve as reminders of the delicate balance between pain and redemption. I still find myself hearing that distant lullaby in the quiet moments, and sometimes, when the wind is just right, I swear I can feel a gentle presence watching over me, a silent promise that even the deepest wounds can, with time, begin to heal. My journey through Mark Twain National Forest was not just an escape from a painful past, it was a confrontation with it. The isolation of the wild forced me to face the parts of myself I had long avoided, and the supernatural occurrences revealed that sometimes the ghosts we fear are reflections of the ones we carry within. I learned that redemption is not a destination, but a continuous process of facing one's inner darkness and finding the courage to let the light in. I do not know if the spirit I encountered ever found the peace she sought, nor do I know if my own path to healing will ever be complete. But I do know that in the silent communion of that haunted forest, I began to understand that the only way to move forward was to accept the shadows of the past and transform them into the strength to forge a new beginning. And so, as I continue to drive on life's winding roads, I hold on to that hard-won wisdom, a promise to myself that even in the face of darkness, hope can still be found. This is my story, a testament to the power of solitude, the challenge of confronting inner demons, and the mysterious ways in which the supernatural can mirror the truths we hide within ourselves. I am Ethan, and though I carry scars from that night in the forest, I also carry the quiet assurance that every ghost, every regret, and every whispered sorrow is an invitation to embrace the possibility of. My name is Alice. I'm 34 years old, and this happened one fateful autumn weekend in 2023 at Tonka State Park, Missouri. I had long dreamed of a weekend escape from the unyielding routines of urban life, and when my closest friends, Ben, Carlos, and Dana, agreed to join me, it felt like the perfect opportunity to reclaim a piece of myself lost in the humdrum of daily obligations. Our journey began with an old, rattling RV that I'd inherited from a distant relative. It wasn't the sleekest vehicle on the road, and its temperamental engine and creaky interior were constant reminders of its age. Still, I believed that its character suited our adventure, a journey into the raw, unspoiled wilderness of Missouri's backwoods where nature held secrets far older than any of us. We set out on a crisp October morning, the early sunlight filtering through amber leaves as we drove along the winding roads toward Tonka. Ben, ever the daredevil, was our self-appointed navigator, constantly urging us to take shortcuts through less traveled paths. Carlos, our pragmatic realist, grumbled about every bump in the road, insisting that our equipment was subpar and that we should have invested in a newer vehicle. Dana, quiet yet perceptive, sat silently at the back, her eyes often drifting to the window as if reading an invisible script in the rustling branches. The first sign that something wasn't quite right came not long after our arrival. We pulled up to a clearing near the park's entrance, a site that looked promising, with a clearing framed by towering oaks and a gentle brook bubbling nearby. However, it quickly became apparent that our chosen campsite was not as accommodating as we'd hoped. The RV hookups were sporadic at best, and the remnants of a previous camp, discarded cans and torn tarps, littered the area. It was as though the land itself bore the scars of neglect and forgotten tragedies. That evening, after a meager meal prepared on a gas stove that coughed more than it cooked, we gathered around a small portable lantern. I tried to instill a sense of calm and order, outlining a tentative plan for the next day's hike along one of the park's famous trails. Yet the underlying tension was palpable. Ben's eyes sparkled with the thrill of exploration. Carlos's face was etched in lines of concern, and Donna's gaze flickered toward the darkening tree line as if she sensed something amiss. As the dusk fell, an eerie quiet took over the camp. I lay in my small bunk, the distant sounds of the forest blending into a soft, unsettling symphony. Suddenly, Dana's voice, trembling with anxiety, broke the silence. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. I sat up, straining to listen. There, beyond the flickering light of our lantern, came faint, indistinct whispers carried by the wind, whispers that seemed almost human, yet laced with an otherworldly melancholy. Unable to shake the feeling of unease, I decided to investigate with Ben by my side. We stepped out into the chill night air, the RV's aging headlights barely illuminating the path ahead. In the distance, near a copse of twisted trees, Ben stopped abruptly. "Look at these footprints," he said, crouching down to examine a series of oversized, oddly shaped prints imprinted in the mud. They were far too large to belong to any animal we knew, and the impressions seemed to lead deeper into the forest. Returning to camp, we found Carlos examining the trees nearby. His skeptical brow was furrowed as he pointed to strange, crude symbols carved into the bark, symbols that looked disturbingly ritualistic. "These aren't random," he muttered. "They're deliberate." Dana, who had been unusually silent, murmured about local legends she'd heard as a child. In hushed tones, she recalled stories of a curse that haunted these woods. A curse born of ancient Native American rituals, of a cannibalistic cult that once roamed the land, and of a shape-shifting spirit not unlike a skinwalker. The more we discussed these unsettling discoveries, the more our individual fears began to fracture the group's fragile unity. Ben's exuberance gave way to a cautious wariness. Carlos's skepticism teetered on the edge of anxious disbelief, and Dana's intuitive dread seemed to intensify with every passing moment. I found myself caught between the roles of rational leader and empathetic confidant, trying desperately to reassure everyone, even as I felt an inexplicable chill creeping over me. The following morning, still reeling from the events of the night, we set out to explore the park's interior. Our path led us along winding trails that cut through dense underbrush and past crumbling stone ruins that whispered of a long-forgotten past. As we hiked, the early signs of eeriness re-emerged. Beneath a canopy of vibrant autumn leaves, I noticed what appeared to be ghostly figures, small, fleeting silhouettes of children playing in the distance. Their laughter, echoing softly, was both enchanting and haunting, a reminder of lost innocence and ancient sorrow. Later that day, while taking shelter in the ERV to dry off from an unexpected downpour, I discovered a hidden compartment in the glove box. Inside lay a faded, handwritten map, its edges brittle with age and its ink smudged by time. The map was annotated with cryptic symbols and notes in a language that none of us recognized immediately. Dana's eyes widened as she traced the lines with trembling fingers. "This," she said in a hushed tone, "is a record of local lore, of a curse that binds these woods to an ancient evil. According to the map, the curse originated from a time when indigenous tribes, desperate to defend their sacred land against encroachment, had invoked dark rituals. These rituals had given birth to a vengeful spirit, a shape-shifting entity that could take on the form of a loved one, a feared enemy, or even an unseen terror lurking in the shadows. The map hinted at a way to ward off this entity using indigenous symbols and rituals, a measure of protection that might hold the key to our survival." That night, the tension among us reached a breaking point. The RV creaked and groaned under the weight of the storm that had rolled in unexpectedly. Thunder rumbled in the distance as we huddled together, our faces illuminated by the flickering glow of a single lantern. Carlos, who had been a steadfast voice of reason, now looked pale and shaken. "I don't know what to believe anymore," he confessed. "It all seems too surreal." Before anyone could reply, the storm's fury reached its crescendo. Lightning flashed, illuminating the campsite in stark, white bursts, and for a split second I saw a figure standing just beyond the RV, a silhouette that resembled one of us, yet was unmistakably different. The figure's eyes glowed with an otherworldly intensity, and its features shifted unnaturally, as if in constant flux. I could feel its gaze piercing through me, as if it were reading my deepest fears. Ben was the first to react, lunging toward the door as if to confront the apparition. "Who are you? What do you want?" he shouted, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. The figure did not respond, but its presence was enough to send a surge of adrenaline through all of us. In that heart-stopping moment, the supernatural reality of our situation became undeniable. As the storm raged on, the entity began its violent assault. The RV shuddered as if struck by an unseen force, and I heard a blood-curdling scream from somewhere outside. We rushed out into the downpour, only to find Ben lying on the ground, clutching his side where a deep, ragged wound bled freely. His face was contorted in pain and terror, and as he gasped for breath, he muttered incoherently about the figure that had attacked him. In the ensuing chaos, it became clear that the entity was not content with mere intimidation. It was violent, an embodiment of the ancient curse that had been unleashed upon us. As we scrambled to administer first aid and secure the RV, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched from every darkened corner of the forest. The entity's presence seemed to weave itself into the very fabric of the night, a malevolent force that flitted between the trees and the storm's shadows. Desperation took hold as Dana, with tears streaming down her face, pleaded for us to remember the map's instructions. "There's a ritual, a way to protect ourselves," she insisted, her voice trembling. "We have to try it now." With no time to lose and the storm intensifying, I gathered what little courage I had left. Drawing on Donna's recollections of indigenous rites, we hurriedly set up a makeshift circle in a clearing near the RV. Carlos, though still doubtful, assisted in arranging stones and twigs into a pattern that mirrored the symbols on the map. As the wind howled around us, we recited the words inscribed in the map, an incantation that, despite its archaic language, resonated deep within me. The air grew thick with an electric charge, and for a moment time seemed to freeze. The entity, which had been darting through the periphery of our vision, paused as if caught in the grip of the ritual's power. The tempest's fury receded into a tense, expectant silence, and I dared to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, we had succeeded in warding off the evil. But the reprieve was fleeting. In a final harrowing moment, the entity surged back with renewed violence. It moved with a predatory grace, shifting its form in a grotesque mockery of human features, and in the blink of an eye, it struck again. Carlos was the target this time, his skeptical demeanor shattered as he was knocked to the ground by a force that defied explanation. I scrambled to help him, my heart pounding in my ears, while Dana's voice rose in a desperate chant, repeating the incantation as if it were the only lifeline between us and the darkness. In that instant of chaos, the storm broke apart into a torrential downpour once more, the thunder echoing the sound of our collective despair. The ground beneath us became a quagmire of rain and blood, and the supernatural force, though momentarily halted by our ritual, seemed determined to exact its revenge. I could see the gleam in its ever-shifting eyes, a look that promised suffering and retribution. Clutching Carlos and Ben, who was now semi-conscious from his injuries, I led the group back to the RV, our sanctuary amid the tempest. Every step felt like a battle against an unseen enemy, every rustle of the trees a reminder that the entity was still among us, lurking in the shadows. The interior of the RV, with its creaking metal and flickering lights, suddenly seemed both comforting and claustrophobic, a fragile barrier against the relentless darkness outside. Inside, we did our best to bandage wounds and calm our racing hearts. Dana continued to chant softly, her voice quivering with both fear and determination, while Carlos muttered apologies for his earlier skepticism, now too broken by the events to deny the reality before us. Ben, barely able to keep his eyes open, grasped my hand, his once impulsive bravado replaced by a silent plea for help. I reassured him as best as I could, though inside I was racked with doubt. Had we truly managed to hold back the ancient evil, or was it merely biding its time? Sleep, if it ever came, was fitful and fraught with nightmares. I awoke several times during the long, dreary night, each time to the sound of distant, agonized cries and the eerie echo of footsteps outside the RV. The protective circle we'd hastily constructed offered little comfort as the storm raged on, and I found myself questioning whether our makeshift ritual was enough to permanently repel the force that haunted these woods. At dawn, the storm subsided to a heavy, oppressive drizzle. The forest was shrouded in a thick mist, and the world outside the RV window looked transformed. A realm where the boundaries between the natural and the supernatural had blurred. With a heavy heart, I gathered what strength I had left and decided that we had to leave. Survival now depended on escaping the cursed lands of Hahatonka before the malevolent spirit could reclaim its hold on us. We loaded the RV as best as we could, with Ben leaning against a wall to rest, and Carlos gingerly supporting himself as we drove away from the clearing that had become our battleground. Dana sat silently in the back, her eyes distant, as if haunted by memories that might never fade. I took a deep breath, my grip tight on the steering wheel, determined to outrun the terror that had left its mark on our souls. As the RV rolled down the lonely, rain-slicked road, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw, for just a split second, a dark figure standing at the edge of the woods. A silent sentinel watching us depart. My heart pounded, and I couldn't help but wonder if we had truly escaped the curse, or if the entity would continue to stalk us long after we left its domain. Over the following days, as we made our way back to civilization, the scars of our ordeal began to manifest in ways that were both visible and hidden. Ben's wound slowly healed, but the memory of that violent attack remained etched in his eyes. Carlos, once so adamant about rational explanations, now spoke in hushed tones of forces beyond human understanding, and Donna, ever the sensitive soul, became withdrawn, her once bright enthusiasm for life now dimmed by the weight of what we had experienced. In the quiet moments of reflection, I found myself poring over the map we had discovered, its cryptic symbols a constant reminder of the ancient curse that had nearly claimed our lives. I couldn't shake the feeling that, despite our desperate attempts at protection, the supernatural presence of Hahatonka was far from defeated. It lingered like a specter in the back of my mind, a warning that some evils were too deeply rooted to be banished by simple rites. I eventually returned home, forever changed by that harrowing weekend. The RV sat in my driveway for months afterward, a relic of our nightmare that I couldn't bear to confront. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind howled outside and the shadows danced on my walls, I would catch a glimpse of something moving at the edge of my vision, a fleeting reminder that the curse of Hahatonka was not confined to the park's boundaries. In time, I learned to live with the memory of those days, a constant reminder that nature holds secrets far darker than we can imagine. And though I have tried to move on, there are moments when I hear a distant, echoing laughter, or the soft whisper of an incantation on a stormy night, and I wonder if the entity still watches from the shadows, waiting for its next chance to strike. This experience taught me that survival is not merely about escaping physical danger. It's also about confronting the ancient, unfathomable forces that have shaped our world long before we ever set foot in it. The curse of Hahatonka, with its violent, shape-shifting specter and echoes of a long-forgotten past, remains etched in my memory as a reminder that some legends are born of truth, and that in the heart of isolation, the line between myth and reality can vanish in a heartbeat. I continue to live with that haunting knowledge every day, a silent testament to the night when a group of friends, bound together by hope and fear, came face to face with a horror that defied all logic. And as I write these words, I know that the shadows of that accursed place still linger in the recesses of my mind, an ever-present whisper of the darkness that lies just beyond the light. My name is Jack. I'm 42 years old, and this happened one chilly autumn in 2023 in the remote depths of Mark Twain National Forest, Missouri. I had left behind a cluttered life in the city, a life filled with mistakes and lingering regrets, in search of solitude and, perhaps, a chance at redemption. My only companion on this journey was my battered old RV, a creaking relic that had seen better days, much like myself. Its intermittent mechanical hiccups mirrored the instability in my heart, and every rattling mile seemed to whisper of secrets waiting to be unearthed. I drove deep into the forest, my destination set on a location known to locals as the Devil's Backbone, a jagged series of rock formations and a clearing rumored to be steeped in history and spectral lore. I'd heard the name in passing, a quiet murmur among those who still believed in the old stories, a place where the past and the supernatural were said to coalesce. I wasn't entirely sure what I was expecting, but I knew I needed to confront the ghosts of my own past and perhaps find some measure of absolution. After hours on winding, rain-slicked roads, I finally arrived at a secluded clearing near the ominous rock formations. The silence of the forest was absolute, broken only by the rustle of wind through dead leaves and the occasional creak of my aging RV settling into place. The clearing itself was bathed in the soft, diffused light of an overcast sky, its jagged silhouette casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to stretch like dark fingers across the ground. I set up camp, parking the RV as close to the rock formations as the uneven ground would allow. I took a moment to stretch and breathe in the cool, damp air, a stark contrast to the stifling confines of my previous life. I was alone now, with nothing but nature and my troubled thoughts for company. Yet, even in that solitude, I felt a curious pull toward the rugged outcrops of stone. Something about them spoke of a history not entirely lost, a history filled with sorrow, regret, and perhaps a hint of forgiveness. Later that afternoon, while inspecting the perimeter of my campsite, I stumbled upon something unexpected. Tucked away beneath a pile of fallen leaves and debris near a cluster of weathered boulders, I found a small, leather-bound journal. Its cover was cracked and worn by time, the pages yellowed and delicate. My heart skipped a beat as I carefully opened it, revealing neat, looping handwriting that chronicled the tragic fate of a local family. The entries spoke of a cursed land, of injustices born out of desperation, and of a spectral figure known simply as the Keeper. According to the journal, the Keeper was a spirit tasked with watching over the area, a silent guardian or avenger, depending on the perspective of those who had encountered it. As I read further, The journal detailed the suffering of a family wronged by fate and circumstance, and it hinted that their sorrow had awakened a presence that still lingered among the rocks. The words resonated with me more than I expected, stirring memories of personal failures and mistakes that I had long tried to bury. I wasn't sure if I was reading a piece of local folklore or a long-forgotten confession of a heart in torment, but I felt inexplicably drawn to every word. It was as if the journal had been waiting for someone like me, a soul burdened with regret, to rediscover its secrets. That night, as darkness descended and a chill wind began to howl through the trees, I sat outside my RV with the journal in my lap. The sound of nature around me was both comforting and unnerving. Every rustle of leaves and snap of a twig set my nerves on edge. I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being observed, not by any living creature, but by something else entirely. The forest felt alive in a way that was almost tangible, a living tapestry of whispered secrets and ancient sorrows. I decided to take a walk along a narrow, overgrown path that led toward the rock formations. The journal clutched in my hand, I ventured deeper into the forest, each step punctuated by the crunch of dead leaves beneath my boots. The air grew colder, and the faint sound of murmuring voices, barely audible over the wind, seemed to follow me. I told myself it was only the wind playing tricks on my ears, yet a persistent unease settled over me. As I approached the Devil's Backbone, the sight before me took my breath away. The rock formations rose from the forest floor like the spines of some ancient, slumbering beast, their sharp edges and rugged surfaces bathed in a ghostly luminescence from the pale moonlight. It was here, in the heart of this foreboding landscape, that I noticed the first sign of something inexplicable. Etched into one of the larger boulders was a series of crude symbols, an intricate pattern that seemed almost ritualistic. They were unmistakably deliberate, not random scratches of time. I knelt to examine them closely, the chill of the stone seeping into my skin. My mind raced with possibilities. Were these symbols an ancient warning, a call for help, or perhaps a means to summon something beyond our realm? Returning to camp, I couldn't shake the image of those mysterious carvings. I spent a sleepless night poring over the journal, comparing its entries with the symbols I had seen. The more I read, the more I began to see parallels between the tragic story of the family and the desolate history of this land. The journal described the keeper as a spectral presence that would manifest on moonlit nights, a silent, somber figure whose only intent was to remind the living of past wrongs and to guide lost souls toward redemption. In the depths of the night, I finally experienced a phenomenon that defied simple explanation. I awoke to the sound of soft, deliberate footsteps outside my RV. At first, I thought it was my imagination fueled by loneliness and regret. But then I heard it again, a measured, almost rhythmic pace on the hard ground. Grabbing a flashlight, I stepped outside into the biting cold. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the dense forest and the looming silhouette of the Devil's Backbone in the distance. And then, I saw it. Standing a few yards away at the edge of the clearing was a figure, a translucent, spectral form that seemed to glow faintly in the dark. The figure was shrouded in an ethereal mist, its features indistinct yet undeniably human. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if guided by a purpose known only to itself. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched, frozen by a mixture of fear and a strange unbidden hope. Was this the keeper the journal had spoken of? I couldn't tell if the apparition was here to punish me for my sins or to offer me a chance at absolution. The figure paused and turned its head as if sensing my gaze. For a long, agonizing moment, our eyes met. My own filled with regret and longing, and its spectral eyes reflecting an ancient sorrow. Then, without a word, the figure gestured toward the direction of the rock carvings, its motion fluid and almost inviting. I stood there, caught between the desire to flee and the overwhelming need to understand. Gathering every ounce of courage, I followed the silent guide toward the symbols etched into the stone. By the time I reached the carvings, a deep internal conflict raged within me. I had spent so many years running from the demons of my past that I had forgotten how to face them. Now, here in this desolate place, with an apparition urging me forward, I felt compelled to confront the weight of my guilt head-on. I sat before the carvings, the journal open in my lap, and allowed the silence of the night to envelop me. I could almost feel the presence of the long-departed family whose tragedy had birthed these legends, a palpable sadness that resonated with my own internal anguish. In a moment of raw vulnerability, I spoke aloud the words I had read in the journal, words that were meant to invoke protection and forgiveness. The incantation was old, its syllables heavy with centuries of sorrow and remorse. As I recited the final trembling line, a gust of wind surged through the clearing, swirling leaves and stirring the ethereal mist. I closed my eyes, overwhelmed by the intensity of the moment, feeling as if I was standing at the threshold of something far greater than myself, a chance at redemption that had been long denied. When I opened my eyes again, the spectral figure was there, its presence now seemingly gentler, as if satisfied with my earnest contrition. It lingered in silence, an unspoken affirmation that the past, however painful, could be confronted and perhaps even forgiven. I sensed no malice in its gaze, only a deep, timeless sorrow and a quiet promise of absolution. The night passed in a heavy, contemplative hush. I remained in that clearing until the first hints of dawn began to soften the darkness. When the sun's early light crept over the horizon, it revealed a landscape transformed, a forest slowly awakening from a long haunted slumber. The spectral presence had vanished, leaving me alone with the echoes of its guidance and the remnants of the journal's tragic tale. I returned to my RV with a profound sense of clarity. The journey back to the clearing had not been without its own challenges. The RV's unreliable engine coughed and sputtered along the uneven road, mirroring the struggles I faced on the inner journey of confronting my past. Yet, each mechanical hiccup seemed to symbolize the breakdown of the old life I had clung to for so long. Over the next few days, I methodically documented my experiences, revisiting the journal and the rock carvings whenever the opportunity allowed. I took photographs, sketched the symbols, and even attempted to decipher more of the cryptic writings. In doing so, I uncovered more of the local history, a tapestry of sorrow, injustice, and the enduring power of forgiveness. I learned that the Keeper was not a vengeful spirit intent on inflicting pain, but rather a guardian of a sacred memory, urging those who wandered into its realm to acknowledge their wrongs and seek redemption. By the time I prepared to leave the forest, I felt a transformation stirring within me. The relentless solitude had forced me to confront the shadows of my past, the regrets that had haunted me like specters in the dark. I had come to Mark Twain National Forest seeking escape, but instead I had found a path toward healing. The Devil's Backbone, with its jagged rocks and ancient carvings, became a silent witness to my journey, a monument to the idea that even the darkest chapters of our lives can, in time, give way to hope and renewal. As I drove the RV back toward civilization, I carried the journal and the memory of that spectral encounter with me. Every bump in the road, every creak of the old engine, reminded me of the delicate balance between the past and the present, and of the profound truth that redemption is not granted by forgetting our sins, but by facing them head-on, no matter how painful the truth may be. I know that I am not entirely free of my regrets, nor have I completely unraveled the mysteries of that haunted clearing. Yet, the quiet guidance of the keeper left an indelible mark on my soul, a reminder that even in isolation, when confronted with the darkest echoes of history and personal failure, there is a way forward. It is a way paved with acknowledgement, forgiveness, and the willingness to embrace change. Now, months later, as I sit in the relative comfort of my small apartment, I still feel the pull of that remote place. The memory of the spectral figure and the ancient carvings remains vivid, a testament to the power of the past to shape our future. In moments of quiet introspection, I revisit the words I once spoke beneath the stars, and I find solace in the knowledge that the journey toward redemption is a path worth walking, even if it leads you into the heart of darkness before the light can finally break through. This experience taught me that sometimes the greatest battles are not fought against external monsters, but against the internal demons we harbor. And in that silent, unforgiving wilderness of Mark Twain National Forest, I found a glimmer of hope amid the echoes of sorrow. A hope that, despite the scars of the past, a new beginning might be forged from the ashes of regret. I drive on, a solitary traveler no longer haunted solely by memories of failure, but now inspired by the possibility of redemption, a possibility that, like the first light of dawn over the devil's backbone, promises that even the darkest night will eventually yield to the day. My name is Jade Anderson. I'm 32 years old, and this is the story of the weekend that changed my life forever. It happened in late October, when I decided to escape the suffocating routine of city life by renting an old RV for a camping getaway deep in Mark Twain National Forest near Salem, Missouri. I had been nursing the wounds of personal loss and hoped that reconnecting with nature would bring solace and clarity. I wasn't alone on this trip. Joining me were Marcus Mark Johnson, Elena Ellie Ramirez, and Lucas Luke Evans, each with their own reasons for seeking refuge in the wild. We'd all met through a mix of work and mutual friends, and while we shared a desire for adventure, our personalities couldn't have been more different. I naturally assumed the role of leader, organizing the trip and managing the small details, though it soon became evident that tensions were bound to rise. The RV itself was a relic, a creaking, temperamental vehicle that had seen better days. Its heating system sputtered in the cold, and the GPS had a habit of sending us in circles. But we made do with what we had. Our supplies were minimal, too. A few lanterns that barely illuminated the night, worn-out tents for backup, and food that wasn't quite up to par for a wilderness retreat. Despite these challenges, our spirits were high as we set off on a drive that promised an escape from the relentless pace of urban life. After a long drive, we finally arrived at our chosen spot, a clearing deep in the forest where ancient trees loomed like silent sentinels. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves, and a fine mist clung to the ground as dusk approached. I parked the RV near what seemed like an abandoned logging road, a spot that offered both seclusion and a hint of mystery. Our first night was relatively uneventful, filled with nervous laughter and tentative conversations around a small, flickering campfire. Mark, ever the skeptic, made several remarks about how the whole eerie atmosphere was nothing more than a trick of the light and our overactive imaginations. Luke, the adventurer, was restless, urging us to explore deeper into the forest. Ellie, always sensitive and perceptive, sat quietly at the edge of the group, occasionally glancing into the darkening woods as if she could sense something beyond our sight. It wasn't long before the first unsettling signs began to reveal themselves. As I was preparing to retire for the night, I stepped outside the RV and noticed something strange on a nearby tree. Carved deep into the bark were unfamiliar symbols, resembling Native American runes, yet distorted by what appeared to be ritualistic markings. My pulse quickened, and I couldn't shake the feeling that these markings were a warning. I called the others over, but Mark dismissed it as nothing more than random vandalism, perhaps the work of a prankster. Luke, however, was intrigued. "This is cool, right?" he said with a lopsided grin, his eyes gleaming with excitement. Ellie, on the other hand, looked troubled. "I've seen these symbols before," she murmured softly, her gaze distant, as though she were recalling a memory too painful to name. I didn't press her, not wanting to pry, but deep down I knew that something was terribly off. The following morning the tension was palpable. Our RV's unreliable nature had led to further setbacks. The engine coughed and sputtered on a narrow forest road, forcing us to stop and assess our dwindling supplies. While we worked to fix minor issues, our discussion naturally gravitated back to the symbols and the strange sounds we had heard the night before. It was around midday when Ellie finally shared what she'd been holding back. We had stopped by a small, weathered ranger station where an old, reclusive Native American elder had mentioned local legends. According to him, there was a story passed down through generations about a secretive cult that practiced forbidden rituals in these woods. Their descendants, some say, still roamed these backwoods, living on the fringes of society, twisted by ancient curses and unspeakable rituals. The symbols we had found were a part of that dark heritage, a ritual language intended to ward off intruders, or perhaps summon protective forces. Ellie's voice wavered as she described the eerie similarities between the carvings and the rituals of this cannibalistic cult, and I couldn't help but feel that we had unwittingly trespassed into a domain far more dangerous than we had imagined. As the dusk fell on our second night, the forest took on an even more sinister character. We set up camp near an old, overgrown trail and decided to keep the RV as our anchor in this unsettling wilderness. The chill in the air was not only from the autumn cold, it was as if the night itself exhaled a breath of dread. Around midnight, while I was double-checking the locks on the RV, I heard a series of soft, disembodied sounds drifting from the woods. It started with what sounded like the laughter of children, playful yet hollow, followed by a low, almost imperceptible chanting. I peered out into the darkness, trying to locate the source, but saw nothing except the dense black silhouettes of trees. Inside, Mark was already up and pacing, muttering about natural explanations and faulty equipment. Luke had his camera out, trying to capture any evidence of the strange sounds, while Ellie sat silently, her eyes fixed on the window as if entranced. The atmosphere grew increasingly oppressive, and it wasn't long before our fears took on a more tangible form. I awoke with a start to find a dark, humanoid figure lingering near the edge of our makeshift camp. The figure stood partially concealed behind a copse of trees, its features blurred and shifting. I couldn't tell if it was man or something else entirely. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached for my phone, but the device was dead, its battery inexplicably drained. I nudged Mark awake, and together we cautiously approached the figure. Luke's bravado propelled him forward despite our whispered pleas to stay back, and he managed to snap a few blurry photos before the figure vanished into the darkness. Ellie, visibly shaken, whispered, "It's not just a ghost. I feel it's malice." Mark scoffed, insisting that it must have been an animal or a trick of the light, but even his voice betrayed a hint of fear. As the night wore on, our internal conflicts became as oppressive as the darkness around us. Mark's rationality clashed with Ellie's intuitions. Luke's reckless curiosity only deepened our sense of impending doom, and I, as the one holding us all together, felt the weight of responsibility crushing me. The RV, our supposed sanctuary, groaned and creaked, mirroring our anxiety with every shudder and mechanical hiccup. The following day brought little relief. We decided to venture a bit further to locate a nearby abandoned ranger station that Ellie had mentioned might hold clues to the local legends. The station was a dilapidated structure, its walls marred by graffiti and nature's relentless assault. Inside, we found old records, faded photographs, and fragments of handwritten journals. One journal, in particular, belonged to a former park ranger who had written about encounters with mysterious figures in the woods, figures that bore the same eerie resemblance as the one we had seen. The entries described violent ambushes by a group of locals whose eyes burned with fanaticism and who were rumored to be descendants of a cult with a dark past of cannibalistic rituals. The writings were sporadic and disjointed, but they painted a picture of a relentless terror that had plagued these woods for decades. Armed with this new knowledge, we felt both vindicated and even more terrified. It wasn't just that we were encountering supernatural phenomena, it was that we were caught in the crosshairs of a living nightmare. That night, back at our campsite, the forest seemed to close in around us. I sat by the RV's small window, my thoughts a whirlwind of fear and uncertainty. Mark maintained his skepticism, but even he couldn't ignore the mounting evidence. Luke, ever the risk-taker, wanted to press on further, convinced that if we could capture more evidence, we could expose what was truly lurking in these woods. Ellie, however, became increasingly withdrawn, her intuitive warnings growing more desperate with each passing moment. At around 2 a.m., the situation escalated dramatically. A sudden, violent shaking of the RV, an apparent mechanical failure, forced us to stop in our tracks. As we scrambled outside to assess the damage, we were ambushed. Figures emerged from the darkness, moving silently through the underbrush. Their appearance was grotesque, a disturbing blend of human and animalistic features, as if centuries-old ritual deformities had twisted their forms. These were not mere apparitions. They were real, physical manifestations of the cult's cursed lineage. Their eyes, wild and feral, bore into us with an intensity that spoke of ancient malice. Panic overtook us. I shouted for everyone to retreat to the RV, but the narrow path back seemed endless under the weight of our terror. Mark's logical mind gave way to raw survival instinct, and Luke's bravado turned into frantic desperation. Ellie clutched my arm, her eyes pleading silently for reassurance even as the figures advanced. The air was filled with the stench of decay and an indescribable odor that hinted at something deeply corrupt. In the ensuing chaos, one of the attackers lunged toward Mark. I watched in horror as he was overpowered by the creature's savage strength. His screams echoed in the night, mingling with the unsettling, rhythmic chanting of the figures. I felt a surge of fear so potent it almost paralyzed me, but adrenaline took over. I grabbed Ellie's hand and urged her to run, my mind racing as I tried to calculate our next move. Luke, true to his nature, attempted to fend off the attackers with a heavy branch he'd picked up, but his efforts only delayed the inevitable. In the frantic scramble, the RV's engine sputtered back to life, a cruel reminder that even our supposed sanctuary was failing us. The figures did not simply vanish after their assault. They circled, their presence a constant, menacing reminder of our mortality. I managed to pull Ellie into the RV, slamming the door shut as we huddled in a corner, hearts pounding in unison. The sounds of struggle, the crunch of leaves under heavy footsteps, and the guttural chants from outside melded into a symphony of terror. I clutched the small journal we had found, its pages now a desperate record of our descent into this nightmare. I knew that if we were to survive, we needed to understand what we were up against. The next morning brought a grim realization. We had lost Mark. His absence was a heavy blow, not just to our morale, but to the very structure of our group. Luke, normally so defiant, was subdued by guilt and fear, his earlier bravado replaced by a haunted silence. Ellie, whose intuitive warnings had been our only true compass, was withdrawn and tearful, unable to reconcile the horror of the previous night with the world we now faced. I took it upon myself to piece together what little we could from the ranger station's journal and the elders' fragmented recollections. The journal described the cult's origins, a legacy of indigenous rituals twisted by generations of isolation and cruelty. These people had once lived in harmony with the land, but a dark pact with unknown forces had turned them into something monstrous. They became guardians of a forbidden secret, their violent ambushes a means of protecting their ancestral rights. The journal hinted that the cult's rituals had a cyclical nature, emerging during times when the veil between our world and something darker was at its thinnest. Armed with this knowledge, I knew we had to act. We couldn't simply wait for the cult to come after us again. With Luke's help, we planned a desperate escape through the forest, following a series of barely visible trails marked by the ancient symbols we had encountered. Every step was a battle against both the physical terrain and the oppressive psychological weight of our situation. Luke, despite his earlier recklessness, became a reluctant but crucial partner as we navigated the labyrinthine woods. The forest was a maze of twisting paths and hidden dangers. The chanting grew louder as we neared a clearing marked by a ring of ancient, moss-covered stones. Here, the air was thick with the residue of old, unspoken rituals. I felt a pull, a mixture of dread and a strange magnetic curiosity, as if the clearing itself was a focal point for the dark energies that had haunted us. It was in that moment that I realized our escape might demand a confrontation with the very evil we'd been trying to outrun. In the clearing, we came face to face with the heart of the cult's domain. Figures emerged from the shadows in a final, desperate attempt to halt our progress. Their leader, a gaunt, imposing figure draped in ragged ceremonial robes, stepped forward. His eyes burned with an unholy intensity as he spoke in a language that sent shivers down my spine, a language that was both ancient and laden with malice. "You have trespassed on sacred ground," he intoned, "and for that, you must pay." It was then that I made a choice. I refused to let fear control our fate. I recalled the fragments of lore from the Ranger's journal and the Elder's whispered warnings. The ritual symbols, I realized, were not just markers of warning, but also of protection. Frantically, I flipped through the journal for any mention of a counter-ritual, a way to repel the cult's influence. In a hastily scrawled note, I found instructions to invoke a protective blessing, a ritual that could disrupt the cult's dark energies if performed with enough conviction. I gathered Luke and Ellie, and with shaking hands, I recited the incantation as described in the journal. The words felt heavy in the cold night air, echoing across the clearing. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a wind picked up, swirling the leaves into a frenzied dance. The cult members recoiled, their expressions twisting between rage and fear. The gaunt leader bellowed a curse, and the ground trembled beneath us. In that chaos, a violent clash erupted. Luke, with all the courage he could muster, wielded a makeshift weapon to fend off one of the attackers, while Ellie and I focused on maintaining the protective circle. The chanting of the cult members faltered, replaced by frantic shouts and the clash of metal against flesh. Amid the turmoil, I saw the glint of a knife, and in that split second, I knew that the battle was as much for our souls as for our lives. The confrontation was brutal. I could hear Luke's desperate grunts and Ellie's quiet sobs as the supernatural force clashed with our human resilience. The clearing became a battleground where ancient curses met modern desperation. The cult's leader advanced once more, but the power of the recited ritual, fueled by our collective will, created a shimmering barrier that repelled his advances. In the ensuing moments, several attackers fell back into the dark woods, their silhouettes vanishing into the mist. When the chaos finally subsided, the clearing was eerily silent. I looked around and saw that we were battered and bruised. Luke was limping, Ellie was pale, and I felt the heavy burden of our losses, especially Mark's absence. Yet, in that silent aftermath, there was a glimmer of hope. We had managed to repel the immediate threat, though we knew that the forest and its dark legacy were far from vanquished. We made our way back to the RV in a somber, determined silence. The journey out of the forest was slow and fraught with lingering dangers, both seen and unseen. Every rustle in the underbrush, every whisper of the wind, reminded us of the night's terror. But each step we took was a step toward reclaiming our lives from the grip of an ancient evil. In the days that followed, as we finally emerged back into the relative safety of civilization, I couldn't shake the memories of that cursed weekend. I spent countless nights poring over the journal, the symbols, and the fragmentary recollections of the local elder, trying to piece together a full account of what had transpired. The experience had left deep scars, both physical and emotional, but it had also awakened in me a fierce resolve to understand and perhaps one day confront the dark forces that still lurked in the backwoods of Missouri. I often reflect on that harrowing weekend as I move forward with my life. I have learned that sometimes the line between myth and reality is frighteningly thin, and that our world, no matter how modern, is built on layers of history and ancient power. The encounter in the Mark Twain National Forest was not just a supernatural nightmare. It was a reminder of the fragility of our existence and the enduring presence of forces beyond our control. I still keep Luke and Ellie in touch, though the memories of that night have changed us all. Luke, once so daring and irreverent, now carries a quiet caution in his eyes. Ellie's intuitive gift, once a source of comfort, has left her with a deep, lingering sensitivity to the unseen energies of the world. And I, as the one who led us through that darkness, bear the weight of leadership and the scars of what it means to confront the unknown. In the end, we learned that survival isn't just about physical escape. It's about confronting the darkness within and around us, and finding the strength to move forward even when the past refuses to let go. My name is Jade Anderson, and I will never forget that cursed weekend when the echoes on the Ozark Ridge taught me that some evils are eternal, and that sometimes the only way to survive is to face them head-on, no matter the cost. The forest still calls to me in dreams, its whispers a constant reminder that the past is never truly gone, and as I navigate the delicate balance between fear and hope, I carry with me the lessons of those long, terrifying nights. A reminder that even in the deepest darkness, the spark of human resilience can light the way home,